Hey, welcome. This video was created for you to relax or fall asleep to. If you enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up for me and subscribe so you can watch more of my videos later on. And as always, there's only 3 ads in this entire video after the first 3 stories. After that, no more interruptions. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. So this story takes place in the winter last year. I work as a chef in a hotel, based in the UK, and as the hotel is in the middle of nowhere, they are able to provide staff accommodation. We also get a lot of people from abroad come and work here for work experience. As most of the staff are quite young who live in accommodation, this of course means quite a lot of partying. One night, me and my friend AJ are finishing a long shift and decide to have a few quiet beers and not attend any of the parties. We go to my room and start chatting about the day's events, and the conversation after a few beers moves on to the paranormal and what we both have experienced. AJ is from Mexico, and he starts telling me about stories from his hometown. I find out that he used to be quite the urban explorer, visiting abandoned locations and documenting them. That's when he tells me about Randonautica. For those of you that don't know, Randonautica is basically an app that asks for your GPS data and sends you a location using randomly generated nearby coordinates. Little did I know at this point that there had been some true horror stories by people who have used this app. I really wouldn't advise it, especially at night. As we were a few beers down at this point and AJ already had the app downloaded, we decided it would be fun to go for a walk and see what was at the location selected by Randonautica. It asked us to think about what our purpose was. For example, find something scary or something unexpected. As it was nearing 2 a.m., of course, we went with something scary. It popped up with 3 nearby locations. As neither of us had a car, we decided to take the one that was closest. As I said before, we live in a hotel in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by woodland and fields. So this meant that we would be walking along back roads in the pitch black, with only our phone torches as light. As we started walking, everything seemed to be amplified. The wind whistling through the trees, the animals rustling in the hedgerows. We walked down a hill near the hotel, and towards the bottom we could see traffic lights, illuminating the path ahead. We were talking and feeling positive, maybe a bit merry from the beers we had before. Nevertheless, we were getting closer to the location, and I started to feel a bit on edge. We crossed into some fields, and this is where things started to get weird. Our path was blocked off by some gates. The gates were padlocked shut, but they were small enough to climb over. The location was past the gates, through the field, and off to the left-hand side. I looked at AJ and suggested we head back, but we both came to the mutual agreement that we had come too far to just turn and walk away. We both jumped over the gate and started walking through the muddy field. Now, it was really dark. The moon had gone behind some clouds, and it seemed to get colder. It was nearing 3 a.m. We both pointed our torches in the way the app was telling us to go, and suddenly, we could see what looked like an old storage container just sat there in the middle of the field. "Is that it?" I asked. "No," said AJ. "It's over in that direction," and pointed to his left. We both continued to walk towards the storage container, though. Don't ask me why. I think it was just out of curiosity. We both stopped at exactly the same time. Our torchlights lit up the front of the container. There, someone had spray painted a clown. A sinister-looking clown. I was frozen. If we had stumbled across this during the day, it would have been scary enough, let alone at 3 o'clock in the morning when we were walking towards the unknown. AJ broke the silence by letting out a nervous laugh. It's just a clown, bro. I just looked at him. Yeah, mate, it's just a clown spray painted on a random storage container in a random field with no one around for miles. After a few seconds, he said, "Let's keep walking." At this point, the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. Something really didn't feel right. I'm not actually scared of clowns, it's just I really didn't expect to see that, and something was off. "It's just over there, bro," he said, pointing at a tree line. Absolutely not, I thought to myself. Not a chance am I walking up to those trees. It was the start of a vast forest that ended at the hotel, nearly 2 miles away. I am not running through the forest and getting lost if there's something out there waiting for us, I said in a shaky voice. Again, we both came to an agreement not to turn back. We edged closer towards the forest until we could see a little opening. "It's in there," he said. I looked and started walking faster towards it. I didn't want this to be drawn out any more than it had to be. Something stopped me in my tracks. My blood ran cold. We were on the tree line at this point, and through the trees I saw a light. Someone, or something else, was there. I knew where that light was. It was in the pinpointed location. I turned for what only could have been a split second to tell AJ we were in danger, when we heard it. Twigs and branches breaking. Whatever it was moving closer. I looked back, even though I knew I shouldn't have, and a tall black figure was standing in between two large oaks. I didn't get a better look. I couldn't. My legs just geared up and I ran. I ran without looking back. Me and AJ were sprinting now, faster than we ever had before. We didn't even know what direction we were heading in. We didn't know how far we ran until we saw that illuminating glow of the traffic lights. We both slowed down, panting and spluttering. It felt like my throat was bleeding as the cold night air hit my face while running, and through gasping breaths had cut my windpipes like glass. We looked around and couldn't see anything. "I think we're in the clear," AJ said through staggering breaths. We walked quickly up the hill towards the hotel. I have never been so happy to see the lights in my entire life. This is a warning. Never download Randonautica, and if you ever do, only use it in the day. Later it came to my attention that people have gone to locations only to find dead bodies, and some people say it's associated with the dark web. I don't know what that thing was or who they were. I guess I never will. What makes this story more scary, I don't think it was paranormal. I think it was a human, lurking in the trees, waiting for us. This happened to me when I was around 10 or 11 years old, back in the early 1990s. Every summer when I was a child, my mother would send me and my younger brother to stay with our cousins in Mexico. It was always a great time. We would spend countless hours playing, going to the beach, eating delicious food, and renting movies. We would normally all sleep in the same room, but on this particular night, an argument ensued between me and my cousins, and they kicked me out of the room. Me, also displeased with them, was just fine with that and decided to sleep in the living room while everyone else slept in their respective rooms. I went to bed around 10:30 p.m. or 11 o'clock. I managed to fall asleep within minutes. Sometime during the night, I do not know the exact time, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard someone knocking on the back door, which led to a back room, which was used for storage. That part of the house was under construction, and a construction crew was coming every day to work on that room, and they were supposed to build a wall and close that room up which at the moment was open, and anyone could have access to it. Now, I heard the knocks followed by pleadings, saying in Spanish, "Miss, please open. Please open. Please." Like I said, I was sleeping in the living room, which was located in the front area of the house, and the knocks were coming from a room that was all the way down the hall. On both sides of the hall were different rooms, which is where my aunt and uncle slept, and my cousins. I was concerned about the pleadings and wondered if that man needed help, but I was also perplexed about the fact that no one else seemed to hear what I was hearing. I actually mustered the courage to get up and investigate, made my way down the hall, and actually attempted to open the door. I twisted the handle several times and the door would not open. All the while, this man continued to plead for someone to open the door. I even attempted to talk to him and said, "Hello, sir? Do you need help?" But he did not respond, just continued to plead for someone to open the door. As I was unable to open the door and also becoming a little frightened, I decided to run back to the sofa bed and get under the covers. Not long after that, I passed out. The next morning, everyone was up. Auntie was cooking breakfast, and my cousins were no longer mad at me. I was ready to tell them about my experience the night before, while we all gathered to sit at the table, but decided to wait and see if anyone else would mention anything about it. And big surprise, no one did. It seems I was the only one who heard that man and the knocks. Summer came to an end, and I was getting ready to say goodbye to my cousins. I was getting ready to have one more ball game with my cousins. The construction crew had also finished the construction of the house, and they were sitting, chit-chatting, and drinking beers. My cousin kicked the ball a little too hard, and it went long. One of the construction men saw the ball coming and picked it up and made his way to me as I ran towards him. He said, "Here's your ball." I said thank you as I grabbed the ball from him, and then he asked, "Why didn't you open the door for me, little girl?" I bolted back to my cousins. My mother picked me and my brother up shortly after that. I continued to go back there a couple more times for the summer, but thankfully, I never saw that man again. I grew up in an extremely small rural town in Florida, on a farm. The population of our town was less than 1,000 people. The closest city, Gainesville, Florida, was about an hour away. The nights were pitch black dark because there were no streetlights or light pollution like in the city, except for the light of a million stars. My great-grandfather passed away when I was about 8 years old, leaving my granny heartbroken. We lived a field away from my great-grandmother, who was about 75 at the time. Unfortunately, Granny had already started getting early Alzheimer's and sometimes didn't act like herself. The family, besides me, decided that it would be best if I moved in with her so that she didn't have to be alone in the evenings and at night. Granny lived in an old farmhouse that she had helped build by hand with my granddaddy in the 1930s. The house was constructed of wood with a tin roof. We did have electricity at this time, but no air conditioner or telephone. The front door was wood, and the top half of the door was a glass window pane with a small decorative curtain across the very top, the kind you might see on a kitchen window. Needless to say, anyone could see inside the house as clearly as we could see them. The door lock was the original one made by my granddaddy. It wasn't really a lock at all. It was a piece of wood nailed to the frame that you turned horizontally when you closed the door, meant to keep someone from pushing the door open. I slept in the room with my granny. Our bedroom was at the very front of the house, right next to the front door, and my bed was pushed directly up to the window that looked out over the front porch and yard. I always felt safe because my family and aunts and uncles lived in the adjacent farms all around us. In 1990, that all changed. I was 10 years old by now. Granny was getting more forgetful, sometimes wandering around the house at night. In the nearby city, something awful had occurred. A man had broken into apartments of several college students in Gainesville, murdered them, and done horrible things to their bodies. There were no suspects. The police called him the Gainesville Ripper. Rumors spread through the community like wildfire. Some said the killer was dressing up like a cable man or electric man to get people to let him in their door. Fear and anxiety grew daily as the police had no leads. My dad decided it was time to teach me how to use our family weapon, just in case. Dad took me out in the woods, and I practiced. That night, I fell asleep with the weapon beside the head of my bed, with clear instructions to not open the door for anyone we didn't know. As a 10-year-old, I felt like this was a pretty big responsibility, and my anxiety kept me from sleeping much those next few nights. They reassured me that I would never have to use the weapon, but better to be safe than sorry. Until the next night, which was the most terrifying night of my life, up until this point. I was laying in bed looking at the digital clock on Granny's dresser, 3:05 a.m., in bright red digits. Granny had gotten up to wander around the kitchen. She did this often, and I just let her do what she thought she needed to do. I heard a tap on the front door window pane. I listened intently, and then silence. Suddenly, the porch light flipped on, illuminating through my little window. What was Granny doing? I scurried out of bed to the front door just in time to reach for Granny's hand as she was trying to turn the piece of wood keeping the door locked. At the same time, I looked out the window, my eyes meeting the eyes of a strange man standing there. The porch light was behind him, and I couldn't see his face very well, but his hair was long and unkempt. I did not know him. He jiggled the handle and pushed hard on the door with all his weight. I was terrified, and I excitedly screamed at Granny, asking what she was doing. She told me Granddaddy was at the door. She sometimes thought Granddaddy was still alive. There was no convincing her it wasn't him. With the man pushing furiously against the door, I had to drag Granny with both hands into the bedroom so I could reach the weapon without giving her a chance to open the door. I grabbed the weapon and ran into the living room, aiming directly at the front door, my finger on the trigger. The stranger was gone. I had no telephone to call for help. We were trapped. I sat in the recliner by the front door, staring out into the darkness beyond the porch light, with weapon in hand for the rest of the night. Unable to swallow, shaking so hard I could barely aim the weapon, I waited for the man to return, to try one of the flimsy windows or the back door. Every moving shadow, distant dog bark, bump in the night, or snap of a twig had my heart racing and blood rushing through my ears. The wind would blow and make the screen door creak open and fall shut with a bang. It was torture. My arms ached from holding the weapon. My nightgown was soaked with sweat, and I was on the verge of bursting into soul-wrenching sobs, but I had a job to do, guarding us from the Ripper. Oblivious, Granny tottered around the kitchen getting ready to make breakfast, because Granddaddy would be wanting his coffee soon. I didn't argue or care what she did as long as she stayed away from that front door. I never saw another glimpse of the stranger, but I felt like he was out there, watching us. After staying wide awake all night, terrified, holding vigil, I made sure Granny was back to sleep, slipped out the back door, and ran straight across the hayfields home to Mom and Dad for help once the sun came up in the morning. The police eventually caught the Gainesville Ripper, and it was not the same man I saw at our front door that night. My family hired an elderly lady to stay with Granny, and I moved home permanently. To this day, I don't know who was at the door on that pitch black night, but I still panic, looking out of windows at night, into the darkness. I would like to start by saying, I am not a strong believer in the paranormal. That being said, the reason I'm here is because I have no explanation for the story I'm about to tell you. To set the stage, I was a senior in high school during the 2020-2021 school year, which means my last year of grade school was complicated. Even though we were allowed in school, there were still a lot of rules and protocols added due to the virus. Long story short, someone in one of my classes got the virus and I sat close enough to them that I got sent home to quarantine for the next 2 weeks. I know. What fun. Well, on top of that, my parents didn't want me spreading the virus to the rest of the family, so I spent days in my room, ate dinner on the other side of the kitchen, and most importantly, moved all my toiletries out of the bathroom my sister and I shared. Luckily, our house happened to have a small bathroom with a shower on the first floor. Unluckily, this meant that when I went through my nightly routine of brushing my teeth and washing my face, I was left all alone downstairs, in the dark. Like I said, I'm somewhat skeptical of the paranormal, but I'm still totally creeped out when I'm left alone in a dark house. So as I rushed through my routine every night, I spent the whole time on edge, worrying that some terrible monster was waiting in a dark corner for me to turn out the last light until it pounced and I would never be seen again. But in the back of my mind, I was certain that it was impossible. In fact, despite my fear, I was absolutely certain I was the only one downstairs for those brief moments when I was the last one awake. Until one night, when I may have been proven wrong. The last thing you need to know is that the bathroom downstairs was one of those that had 2 doors on either side. One led to the kitchen, and the other led to my dad's office. My dad's office also had 2 doors, one that was always closed and led to the bathroom, and one that was always open and faced the base of the staircase. So one night, exactly like any other that week, I was scrubbing my teeth as fast as I could, while keeping an eye on the mirror to make sure there was nothing trying to sneak up behind me. I had spit my toothpaste out and was rinsing the toothbrush off when my ears perked up. Over the rushing water coming from the faucet, I thought I heard my dad call my name from the top of the stairs. The sink was so loud and his voice was so quiet that I wasn't entirely certain what I had heard. So I turned the water off and shook my toothbrush dry while I strained my ears against the uncanny vacuum of silence that filled my house. I figured that if I had heard my dad, he'd call my name again to get my attention. So when I didn't hear so much as a breath for the next few seconds, I figured I was just hearing things. I turned the faucet on again and began washing my face. And when I turned it back off, I heard my dad call my name again. This time it was so clear and unmistakable. Not only did I know it was my dad who was calling me, but I was also able to tell that he was on the landing of the staircase, slightly closer now. "Yeah?" I called back, feeling a little sorry that he probably thought I was ignoring him, when I really had heard him call my name after all. I waited for a response, tilting my head slightly toward the open doorway leading to the kitchen. However, the response I received was not the one I was expecting. Instead, from the closed door that separated the bathroom from the office, came 3 distinct, single-knuckle knocks. I was very confused at this point, wondering why my dad hadn't responded to me, what he needed to tell me that required him coming all the way downstairs to the bathroom, and why he decided to go to the locked door from the office instead of the open one from the kitchen. Now, I could have just opened the door he was standing behind, but for some reason, I found myself taking the unnecessarily long route out of the bathroom, through the kitchen, through the hallway, and to the open door to the office. This isn't a decision I remember making. I just did it. In fact, I wasn't thinking about anything, including the fact that I never actually heard my dad's footsteps approach the door, or even come down the creaky staircase. And I certainly had no idea what to think. When I turned the corner to look into the office, I stood in the open doorway and strained my eyes against the inky darkness, looking at the spot where my dad should be standing. But he wasn't there. Needless to say, I went straight to my room and turned on every light on the way. It took me a long time to calm myself down and fall asleep that night. All I could think of was staring into the darkness of that office and wondering what might have happened if I had just opened the door when I heard the knocking. I was around 17 when this incident happened. I was in junior college and had rented out a tiny apartment in a standalone building. This building was right behind a construction site, meaning that not many people were around this place, especially in the night. For context, I was living with another girl, let's call her Nancy, who was completing her education too. One day, I had to go attend a friend's birthday party. There were about 12 people that attended the party that evening. I didn't expect it to be late by the time I'd get back home, so I did not see it as a problem that my friend wouldn't be able to accommodate me, in case something were to go wrong. However, things did not go as I had planned. Being young and stupid, I gave in to my friend's request to stay at the party until late that night. This meant that I would be on my own when I was to go back home, since there simply was no space for me in my friend's tiny apartment, especially not when she had 5 more people staying over that night. To avoid going back alone, I brought 2 of my companions for a sleepover, Sandra and Kathia. Our Uber dropped us off in front of the construction site, since that night the conditions were less than ideal to drive to the building I lived in. The workers had just been careless and left piles of concrete in the way. We were left with no choice but to cross the construction site to get home. I remember how Sandra kept saying that she was a little apprehensive, and she should have taken her pepper spray along with her. I tried to act brave, but honestly was a little scared. Kathia, on the other hand, was carefree, and we followed her lead. We were walking through the construction site when we saw something that took us aback. We saw a bizarre, flickering, blazing light coming from one of underneath the construction buildings. It was really odd, as there was no chance that it was a construction worker at 2:30 a.m. in the middle of the night. Before we had time to register what was going on, we heard something that made our hearts stop for a moment. It was a shrill, frantic cry of a woman coming from the same building. Judging by the sound of her voice, she was in excruciating pain. What happened next gives me nightmares to this day. We saw someone falling from the building, literally meters away from us, causing an earth-shattering thud. Sandra almost yelled in terror, but Kathia was able to quickly grab her mouth to make the sound fade. Thinking on her feet, she grabbed us both by the arm and pulled us behind a half-constructed wall of another building. Just to be sure that no one could see us, we stayed behind this wall for what seemed like forever. Suddenly, we saw someone wearing a bright yellow jacket exiting the building, with a gas cutter in his right hand and an amputated arm in the left. We couldn't see his face because the place was not well lit, and it was almost pitch black there. Honestly, considering the absolute horror that we were in, that was the last thing that would cross our minds. After another eternity of making sure that we were now safe, we made it back home, still trembling with fear. We called 911. The police came and investigated. After a few days, we learned that it was a homeless woman who was murdered brutally that night. Her arm was cut off with a gas lighter, and she was pushed out of the 5th story and left to bleed and die. However, to this day, after several failed attempts, investigators have no clue as to who the murderer was. Last summer, I went to a house party in the Garryowen neighborhood of Limerick, here in Ireland. We were right in the middle of lockdown restrictions, and I know it was really stupid and selfish of me to go, but I was just so in need of a stress release. I'm a really social creature, and I need to spend time around people. Like I was actually going mad being stuck inside all on my own. I do actually really regret going, but breaking the virus restrictions aren't the reason I wish I hadn't gone, because I saw one of the worst, most horrifying things I have ever seen in my life at that party, and it's something I don't think I'll ever get out of my head. So the party is going swimmingly for a few hours, and I'm occupied being the little social butterfly that I am. But then I walk into the kitchen to get another drink, and this big argument is unfolding between this couple that seemed to be based around allegations of infidelity. It was super intense and awkward being in there with them, so I just quietly grab my bottle of wine from the fridge and then head back to where I was gabbing away with some new friends. I didn't really think much of it. House parties can be weird like that after all. One room people are passed out. Another one had people dancing around, while some rooms host little arguments between couples that usually don't turn into something hideous. Only this one did. The guy in the argument storms out of the party, and then for a few hours everything is good vibes again. But then at some point later in the night, the guy comes back to the party. People know his face by this point, so they don't really have any reason not to let him in. And I'm guessing he didn't give them any clues as to what he was about to do. Otherwise, they would have never let him back into the house. The guy then searches the house to find the girl he had been arguing with. I'm not actually sure if they were a couple. I just heard them arguing about sleeping around. When he finds her, he confronts her, starts screaming at her, then reaches into his jacket, takes out a bottle, and then appears to douse her with the contents. People thought he was just being a jerk and throwing vodka on her. The outrage partly stemming from the wasted alcohol as well as the undue aggression. He then legs it from the room while she's screaming. From the people I've spoken to about it, the ones that were in the room when it happened, they first thought her screaming was her being a bit melodramatic about having some drink chucked on her face. But then, she took her hands away from her face, and it's covered in what looks like burns. It wasn't alcohol he had thrown onto her face that night. It was acid. Luckily, someone there was a chemistry graduate. They realized what was happening almost straight away, and then grabbed something from under the kitchen sink that would neutralize the acid. I don't know what it was exactly, but it was some other chemical that probably didn't do her much good either, but it definitely stopped the damage from being any worse than it was. I heard the poor girl had to have a skin graft from her leg though. Like even with the help she got, her injuries were absolutely horrific. The guy who did it went on the run for a bit too. Like the Gardaí, what we call the police in Ireland, didn't manage to get cuffs on him for like a month. And we were all so relieved when they finally did. I can't imagine what kind of monster does something like that after an argument. To use actual acid to try to permanently disfigure someone's face. That takes a really special kind of evil, don't you think? To all outside observers, it appeared that Dr. John Hamilton and his wife Susan had the perfect, loving marriage. In their 14 years of blissful union, John's passionate love for his spouse had led him to lavish her with expensive gifts and luxurious vacations. A brand new Porsche on their wedding day being just the beginning of a long list of romantically motivated purchases. But John wasn't just generous with his money. He was apparently generous of heart, too, and spent a great deal of time reminding Susan just how much he loved her in a variety of heartwarming ways. When Susan professed a yearning for employment, for a purpose outside of being a housewife, John gave her a job at his highly esteemed obstetrics and gynecology clinic in Oklahoma City. He was there for her in every way, and by all accounts they were a textbook case of romantic longevity. But that's what makes it all the more horrifying, that on Valentine's Day of 2001, Dr. Hamilton's arrival at the family home kicked off a chain of events that would turn their perfect little world into a living nightmare. As you can imagine, in a marriage as loving as John and Susan's, Valentine's Day was held in high esteem. Every single year they were married, they exchanged gifts and cards, often having planned some kind of romantic rendezvous, be it dinner and a movie or a walk around a local park. But on Valentine's Day of 2001, John was needed in the operating room of his clinic, fairly early in the morning too. Any exchange of gifts would have to wait until his lunch break. But just as he promised, John ducked out of the clinic as soon as he was able and drove home to spend a romantic half hour with his wife, after which he would have to return for another surgery. He called her name as he walked through the front door, but she didn't answer. John suspected that his wife might have some kind of surprise in store for him, and he felt a ripple of excitement run through him as he walked up the stairs towards the master bedroom. He called his wife's name again, but still there was no answer. And it was then that something caught John's eye. Lying on the floor of the second-floor bathroom, it was Susan. She was in a crumpled, lifeless heap, with blood pooling underneath her. Paramedics were called to the scene, but Susan couldn't be revived. Those in attendance noted that she appeared to have been strangled with two of her husband's expensive silk neckties. But the blood on the bathroom floor was undoubtedly from the series of bloody head wounds she had due to repeated blunt force trauma. The wounds being so severe that parts of her brain were exposed, while her face was completely unrecognizable. To his absolute horror, Dr. John Hamilton was the number one suspect in his wife's murder from the very beginning. Police have since publicly stated that there were many factors which led them to such a conclusion. The first being that there was no sign of forced entry to the home. Whoever killed Susan had keys to the residence. It was also a crime in which nothing of value was stolen, and one which there were no bloody fingerprints left in a bathroom, which had blood almost everywhere. This meant that there was a distinct chance that whoever killed Susan was either extremely professional, incredibly lucky, or had the time and privacy to scrub the scene of incriminating evidence before the body was found. On top of that, while searching the home, police got their hands on a Valentine's Day card that Susan had written to John, presumably that year. And in the message inside wasn't nearly as loving and cheerful as you might imagine. I bought this 2 weeks ago, so I guess maybe it doesn't seem as appropriate. But I do love you. Have a great day. Susan. The contents of the card raised a lot of questions concerning the state of Hamilton's marriage. Evidently, it suggests that there had been some kind of incident or argument, one that had caused a degree of turmoil and somewhat soured that Valentine's feeling. As it later turned out, this incident involved Susan catching John making phone calls to a woman employed as a topless dancer. Police actually found hundreds of calls to this person on John's cell phone during their investigation, and heard from close friends of Susan that she had confessed to considering a divorce. To the cops, the explanation seemed simple. John had murdered his wife to prevent her from running off with half of his money. But at his trial, much of the local community came out in support of Dr. Hamilton and refused to believe that the man was capable of such a horrific crime, especially given that the victim was his own beloved wife. But when the paramedics who attended the 911 call John made were questioned in court, the jury began to notice some disturbing inconsistencies in his story. Hamilton testified in court that after he contacted emergency services, he had gotten to work trying to perform CPR on his wife's bloodied corpse. And this appeared to be true, as the paramedics confirmed that when they had arrived, John had been performing chest compressions. But as people who performed CPR on an almost daily basis, the paramedics noticed something peculiar about John's technique. It was incredibly ineffective. From a regular person with no first aid training, that could be understandable. But John's was so bad that it almost looked like he wasn't actually trying to revive Susan at all, which for a medical professional is very suspicious. John also claimed that he had tried performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on his wife, but the paramedics claimed that John had no blood on his mouth or face when they arrived. There was so much blood around the victim's head that there's no way John could have performed mouth-to-mouth and not gotten any on him. Some of Susan's blood was also found on the steering wheel of Dr. Hamilton's car, and despite his claim in court that he had simply moved the vehicle to make room for emergency vehicles, a prosecutor was able to make use of the overall suspicion to claim that this was evidence that John had been considering an escape attempt. At one point during the trial, the prosecution's case against Dr. Hamilton appeared to be floundering. Hamilton's defense attorney had brought a number of key character witnesses to testify in court, and all had built a picture of John as nothing but a loving husband, and he believed that the nail in the prosecution's coffin would be the testimony of a crime scene investigator named Tom Bevel, an expert on blood splatter at crime scenes. Bevel was essentially brought in to confirm that the blood splatter on Dr. Hamilton's shirt, the same one he was wearing during his attempt at CPR, was consistent with a man simply trying to revive his murdered wife while in a state of extreme panic and grief. At first, Tom Bevel did indeed testify that much of the blood splatter could have well been from the doctor's attempts at CPR. But as it turned out, Bevel had noticed something that other investigators had overlooked. He had made a note of the few small flecks of blood that could be found on the inside of Hamilton's right sleeve, a pattern he had seen many times before on the clothing of people who have killed someone with a blunt object. In the seconds that followed, the courtroom was deathly silent. An expert defense witness had testified against the person they were supposed to be defending, and in just a few words, Tom Bevel had condemned Dr. Hamilton to prison. When later asked why he made the decision to essentially act as a witness for the prosecution, Bevel claimed he just had to tell the truth. He said he had sworn an oath, something that overrode any allegiance he may have had to his client. After that, it only took 2 hours for a jury of his peers to find John Hamilton guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, whereafter a judge sentenced him to life in prison. Those that followed the case were highly disturbed by the sudden turn of events. John had and still does maintain his innocence, even to this day. But more and more evidence points to the idea that he killed his wife in cold blood. His defense team even floated the idea that he must have been innocent, because the guilty timeline would mean that John went to work and performed flawless surgeries right after murdering the love of his life. This might well be true, but in light of the guilty verdict, it's all the more damning. because it suggests that Dr. John Hamilton was able to beat his wife's skull in on Valentine's Day, then remain calm and collected, enough to go and perform complicated medical surgeries. And if it's true, then maybe a more fitting name for Dr. Hamilton is Dr. Death. Hi, my name is Lindsay. I'm a 19-year-old female living in Pennsylvania with my parents and two of my sisters. We live in a pretty rural area, and there isn't much that goes on out here. I listen to your stories every morning at work and always wished I had a scary story of my own to share. Well, tonight, I got my scary story. To preface this story a bit, me and my older sister have only been hiking one time before this experience, so we are by no means pros. We do, however, always bring some items for safety, such as pocket knives, flashlights, and a medical kit. For this story, I will not use my sisters' names for the sake of their anonymity. My older sister will be called M, and my younger sister will be referred to as F. So today is F's birthday, and she has never been hiking before, and we figured we would bring her on a little hiking trip to take advantage of the beautiful weather. The area we hiked at prior is actually part of the state game lands. Hikers are permitted on the mountain trails during the off-season of hunting. However, not many folks know about this spot because there are no signs or anything until you walk the mile or so into the woods. By then, you reach a small parking lot of sorts, which is always empty. There are two main trails that are marked with the occasional blue dot on a nearby tree. If not for these spray paint dots to mark the path, you might not even know it is a trail because of how little use these paths see. Probably not the best first hiking spot for a couple of newbies like us, I know, but it's super close to us and makes for a quiet hike with lots of scenery. So we decided to once again hike that trail because we were somewhat familiar with it. We were decently excited and ready to have a nice relaxing hike through the mountain and hopefully get some cool pictures. We started walking from our house all the way to the bottom of the mountain, where we would begin our hike. On our way there, we were telling F about the trail and how beautiful it was. M then expresses concern that there could be animals of all sorts nearby, because the area isn't normally frequented by many humans. I figured there would be animals, of course. It is the woods after all. But I never imagined anything like what I am about to describe in this story. After walking for about 15 minutes, we reached the parking lot. M led the way with me in the middle, and F following closely behind. The first couple of steps onto the trail require you to walk up a small but steep hill. M crested the hill before F and I, and as she did, we heard a pretty loud rustling noise off to our left. I naturally chalked the noise up to some birds, or maybe a squirrel messing around in a tree. But then, M suddenly stopped in her tracks, causing F and I to also pause briefly. Just as I was about to ask what the problem was, M calmly said, "Turn around, guys." Me and F just looked at her confused, not understanding what she meant. I just started asking why, and she said probably the scariest thing I have ever heard. "There is someone over there. Run." Now, that sentence was a lot more scary to me and F, because we know M very well, and she doesn't scare easily. So to hear the clear panic in her voice as she ordered us to run away from something that neither F or I saw was terrifying. M and F immediately started sprinting back down the small hill as I was still standing in my place. I quickly looked behind me, but I saw nothing. I did hear something, though. I was still very confused because I hadn't actually seen anything, and M never saw what she saw. I ran over to M and F, who were waiting for me just before the entrance to the parking lot. I think part of the reason I hesitated running right away was because I thought M might be exaggerating a little. I should have known by the look on her face that she was not messing around. I had a miniature hatchet multi-tool and a pocket knife on my belt, and you better believe I had them at the ready. I had no idea what I was expecting, but I knew that whatever might run out of those woods behind us was going to get a full face of stainless steel. When I reached my sister's, I asked Em what exactly we were running from. She just told us to keep moving as she constantly looked back at the trail we had just come from. She even told us to jog just in case it was following us. We did. After maybe jogging a quarter mile or so, Em finally told us what we were running from. She said she looked in the direction of the noise we had all heard, and what she saw was a gray figure hunched over about 10 feet off the trail. She described it as being at least the height of F, who is around 5'6". She said it looked to be bipedal, but she didn't stick around long enough to take in every detail about the figure. However, she did note that it looked as if it was shuffling towards us. I believe that's what made her get us out of there so fast. She must have feared that we were being chased. Now, I never have believed in monsters of cryptids or anything, but Em said she honestly has no idea what the thing was. We don't have any type of animal in Pennsylvania that matches that description, at least as far as I know. I know that black bears stand on their hind legs sometimes, but they are not gray, and it didn't sound big enough to be a bear. The only other thing it might have been is a human. But why would someone hear us obviously distressed and not call out to let us know they were there and were not a threat? Unless the person was not there as a friendly hiker. Possibly a person living on the mountain. Maybe someone doing drugs and were afraid they would get busted. I don't know. That seems to be the only logical explanation. But I am not fully convinced it was a person. I don't believe in Bigfoot or anything else like that. But who knows? By the time we were almost home, Em told us that she used to go to the bus stop with two of the neighbor kids years ago. She said they would always talk about a mystery animal that they would see walking around in the woods near their house, which is very close to the state game lands. At first, she didn't believe them because she had never seen such a thing. But one time, when the neighbor kid's grandmother was with them at the bus stop, Em asked about this mystery animal. The grandmother is and has always been a religious person and didn't seem to be the type of person to believe in something like her grandkids had explained. But to Em's surprise, the grandmother said she also witnessed the mystery animal lurking around. What's more, is our house is just across the lawn from where our neighbors claimed to spot this unknown creature. I am not sure if these two experiences are related. Besides, that was years ago. But could the figure Em encountered in the woods tonight be the mystery animal? Maybe it was a human. Maybe it was an animal. Who knows for sure? But what I do know is, I don't think we'll be hiking on that state game lands again anytime soon. "20-year-old Kelly Berg Dove lived with her 4-year-old daughter in Bridgewater, Virginia. She was a popular young woman. Not a single soul in all of Bridgewater seemed to have a bad word to say about her. Least of all her loving husband, who she'd been romantically involved with since they were both high school sophomores. She also made a point of keeping in touch with her mother and sisters, almost every single day. All in all, Kelly was about as wholesome a person as you're ever likely to find, and even found the time to work night shifts at a local gas station to help support her family. They weren't exactly strapped for cash, but Kelly valued the idea of making a contribution that would allow them a taste of the finer things in life, as well as squirreling a little of her paycheck away each month for her daughter's college fund. But sometimes terrible things happened to the most wonderful of people. And on the night of June 18th, 1982, Something was about to happen in the sleepy town of Bridgewater that would send shockwaves through the close-knit community. On the night in question, Kelly was working her usual night shift at Harrisonburg's Imperial gas station on South Main Street, Route 11. Kelly had gotten the job because her 3 sisters had either worked there in the past or were still currently employed by Imperial. The employer thought it would make the girls more accountable for their work, and he was right. Whenever one was sick or couldn't come into work, another would always take her place. And on this night in particular, Kelly was covering for one of her sisters for a little extra college money for her young daughter. Kelly's mom, Rachel, was also a very loving and attentive person, and would often call the gas station whenever one of her daughters was working to check if they needed any food or hot coffee brought over to help them through their shift. When Rachel spoke to Kelly that night, nothing seemed to be amiss. To her, it was just another average night at a mostly quiet gas station in rural Virginia. But little did she know, this would be the last time she would ever talk to her daughter, as the evening's events were about to take a rather dark and terrifying turn. At around 2:30 in the morning, long after Kelly's mom had retired to bed, Kelly apparently called the Harrisonburg police. The call was to inform them that she had been aggressively harassed by a guy she had described as improperly dressed. It seems Kelly was far too polite to describe what this male customer actually did in any kind of detail, but it's safe to assume that the implied meaning was that he had exposed himself to her. Just a few minutes after this first call, Kelly called again, this time pleading with the dispatcher for a patrol unit to be sent to the gas station. The same man that had apparently exposed himself was calling the station to make obscene threats, and it seems that Kelly was growing anxious, as she believed he was willing to follow through with them. The dispatcher promised to get a unit out to her as soon as possible, and that she should hang tight. However, just moments after the second call ended, Kelly called 911 yet again. Only this time, she was in a complete panic. With a voice that was dripping with fear, she demanded to know how far away the responding police officers were, as the same deranged customer had apparently returned and was sitting in a silver or gray Ford that was parked in the gas station's forecourt. The last thing the 911 dispatcher heard was Kelly screaming that the man had just gotten out of the vehicle and was heading towards the gas station's main building. She then slammed the phone down, apparently preparing to defend herself. The cops rushed over to the Imperial gas station, expecting to arrive to a violent assault in progress. But to their bemusement, when they arrived at the gas station, the place was as quiet as the grave. They searched the entire site, but Kelly was nowhere to be found. All that remained was her purse. There were no signs of any kind of violent struggle, no indications the store had been robbed, but there were also no clues as to where Kelly was. It was as if she simply vanished into thin air. What's clear is that if the suspect was armed, he could have forced Kelly into his vehicle in just a matter of seconds. Kelly's family believed this to be the case, as they insist that any attempt by an unarmed man to grab her and shove her into their vehicle would have resulted in Kelly fighting back vigorously. The police investigation that followed led officers to a nearby convenience store, where a clerk informed them that he had been visited by a man driving a gray vehicle about a half an hour before Kelly's disappearance. The clerk told them that the man was aged between 20 to 25 years old and had blonde, shoulder-length hair. This might seem like an obvious lead, but the cops were unable to track down this man, so no connection between him and Kelly's apparent abduction could ever be made. The police then interviewed Kelly's 3 sisters, who were also employed by the gas station. They were shocked to hear that the obscene kind of phone calls that Kelly had received that night were commonplace, but that no one had ever acted on them, believing them to be from some harmless old pervert whose bark was louder than his bite. They also didn't entirely believe that the man that had harassed Kelly that night was the same person making the phone calls, as there didn't seem to be anything overly threatening about the lewd calls, while the driver of the silver or gray Ford was obviously aggressive enough to show up to the gas station in person. Yet after news hit that one of the gas station girls had apparently been abducted, the phone calls seemed to stop entirely for a while, only resuming around 6 weeks later, when this apparently harmless old perv called and made lewd comments to one of the gas station's new hires. This could well be because whoever was making the calls simply wasn't involved in the abduction and didn't want to implicate themselves as a suspect in such a violent and disturbing crime. But it could also be because the same person who made the calls was satisfied with abducting Kelly and didn't feel the need to make another call, not until the same hunger resurfaced in them around a month and a half after the fact. When local media outlets contacted Kelly's parents regarding their daughter's disappearance, they gave a rather shocking answer to some very probing questions. When asked if they had any idea who might have kidnapped or harmed their daughter, and if this person might be a member of the local community, Kelly's parents unequivocally answered in the affirmative. Although the police had asked them not to publicly speak the man's name, they believed her abductor had been someone Kelly had gone to high school with, someone who had a long history of indecent exposure and making obscene telephone calls, and according to Kelly's sister, also drove a silvery gray Ford. But surely if Kelly had known the man personally, even just by association, she would have named him in one of the 3 911 calls she made, leading up to her abduction. But it's also very possible that this person had either obscured their face somehow, or Kelly had simply not recognized him, given that they had both graduated some time ago. There's also the possibility that Kelly was so terrified that she just failed to mention the man by name during one of those calls. Either way, the police obviously found the possibility of this man being the culprit so plausible that they asked Kelly's parents not to use his name publicly. Yet despite this, he was never charged with any crime, as there was simply not enough evidence to attempt any kind of conviction. There were several other suspects in the case, and authorities were sure to question all of them. But at a time when CCTV cameras and DNA evidence were still just technological pipe dreams, actually placing a suspect at the scene that night was all but impossible. For all intents and purposes, the person who showed up at the Imperial gas station that night is a ghost. Someone who showed up, bundled Kelly Berg Dove into a vehicle, and then seemingly vanished themselves. Barely a trace of either of them was left behind. Merely a purse and a vehicle description. Far too little for the cops to go on to secure a suspect. Kelly or her body. Almost 40 years later, what happened that night remains almost a total mystery, with Kelly being declared legally deceased by local authorities. Despite her family pouring money into private investigators to try and find out exactly what happened, they are no closer to getting any solid answers as they were almost 4 decades ago. The only truth we have of that night is the terrifying reality that Kelly went to work that night, not suspecting a thing, and ended up encountering someone that caused her to vanish from the face of the earth. And that, horrifyingly enough, is something that could happen to each and every one of us. Back in the late 70s, I was a little girl around 7 or 8 years old. I loved spending time out on my uncle's farm, as I found it to be a source of stability in my life. My mom couldn't sit still, as my grandma would say. We moved all the time, 12 times just in 1 year alone. My uncle worked a full-time job and had to run his farm, so when drifters would come by, he would offer a place to stay and good home cooking, courtesy of my aunt, in exchange for an extra helping hand around the farm. One Saturday after a long day of work, my uncle took one of these farmhands out for dinner to the local restaurant, which was also the bar, gas station, and market. He lived in a tiny village with the only other establishment being a church at that time. My uncle returned home without his farmhand. We'll call him Tom moving forward, stating that he had stayed behind at the bar to hang out with the other patrons. Later that night, my cousin Rick came home and had decided to sleep on the couch in the living room instead of risking waking my aunt and uncle as he tried to sneak to his bedroom. You see, Rick was only about 15 or 16, if I remember correctly, and had gotten home way past his curfew. He had only been laying down for about 30 minutes or so when the front door opened. It was Tom, and he was covered in blood. Now, my cousin knew that Tom was a farmhand and could possibly have been butchering an animal, but he couldn't understand why he'd be doing that at this time. All he knew is that something told him to keep his eyes closed and pretend to be sleeping. So he did. Tom stood there for an unusually long amount of time just staring at him before he finally walked away. Rick could then hear what sounded like the washing machine start up, then the shower turning on. He recalls thinking the entire situation was odd, but did eventually manage to fall asleep. The next day started out like any other until my aunt returned home from church. She had to deliver the terrible news to my uncle that his lifelong friends that owned the local restaurant, bar, market, etc. had been brutally hacked to death the night before with an axe. They were a husband and wife that had their home attached to their business. Upon hearing the news, my cousin Rick thought back to Tom coming in that night covered in blood. He took my aunt aside to tell her what he had witnessed and to see if maybe Tom would have been working that late. But of course, the answer was no. She called the sheriff's office, who came out right away. Luckily, some blood was left on the washing machine, and even though DNA evidence was nothing back then like it is today, they were still able to trace the blood to one of the victims. The thing that scares me the most about this is that it came out in court that Tom had stated to the sheriff that when he returned to my uncle's home that night, if anyone had been awake, he was going to kill them all, and now wishes that he had. You see, I was sleeping on the couch opposite of my cousin that night. My mom never let me spend the night again. Okay, so a little bit of backstory for this. My great-grandmother's second husband was apparently a total sadist who systematically abused her grandchildren for many, many years, in pretty much every way you can imagine. These grandchildren happened to be my dad and his sisters, and it had a horrendous effect on them, as you can probably imagine. It was also totally unknown to anyone but them until quite a while after he died, which coincidentally was around the same time I was born. So as I said, the abuse had a really harsh effect on my family's collective psyche, and it made them vigilant to the point of paranoia when it came to protecting me from a similar fate. As a result, I was basically never allowed to play outside without strict supervision, and I most certainly was never allowed to go to sleepovers at my friends' houses when I was a kid. Anyway, this story takes place back in the early 90s, when I was about 7 or 8 years old. My family was living down in Florida just when the holidays were about to roll around. We were a very close family, for reasons I already stated, so my Nana lived with us right up until the day she passed. She helped out around the house, and with a lot of childcare stuff, so whenever I was home due to school holidays or whatever, she would always look after me whenever my mom and dad had to work. I adored her with all my heart. She was just about the best Nana that anyone could ever wish for, and she was tough as an old boot, too. So this particular year, I was lucky enough to have gotten the one thing I really, really wanted Santa to bring me: a brand new pair of roller skates. I was obsessed with them, and from the moment I got them, I was itching to practice so I could get good enough to start going really fast, or nail some tricks on them. One afternoon, I'm zooming up and down the sidewalk outside our house, getting better and better with each passing hour, while Nana is sitting on the porch and keeping a close eye on me in between bouts of reading a magazine or a book or something. Then at one point, the phone rings, and Nana basically has no choice but to duck inside to answer it, since it might have been my mom or dad saying they needed to stay late at work or something. I don't know. Something important anyway. I'm guessing she dithered on calling me inside, knowing I would kick up a fuss if I had to stop skating even for a minute. So she must have figured that she could probably duck inside and answer the phone without it being too much of a risk. But as she did, she kept the main door open so she could still see me through the screen door. It took a minute or two for her to get back from the call, but nothing went down during that time. So I figured that gave her a little peace of mind that she didn't have to worry about me all the time. When she gets back, she goes back to reading her thing while I was hard at work learning to spin on the spot or whatever trick I had my heart set on learning. Then after maybe another 45 minutes or so, she calls to me that it was time for a lemonade break and that we had to go inside. I remember begging her with everything I had to just please let me skate for just a little while longer. I managed to bargain with her somehow, telling her I'd skate just a few more minutes, but also swearing that I would come inside as soon as she made the lemonade. No ifs or buts. She kinda scowls at me for a second, probably silently cursing the fact that she couldn't quite say no to me whenever I begged her like that. But she eventually agreed before going inside to get the lemonade ready. But when she did, she tells me to sing as loud as I can so she can hear me from the kitchen and know that I was still there. So I did as I was told, and warbled all the Boys to Men lyrics I knew while I continued to skate up and down. Then, maybe only a few minutes goes by, and I look up to see this big old van turn onto our street. It starts cruising along all slow, almost looking like they were lost or looking for something. But I mean, I didn't pay it any mind. I was a kid, naive, and besides, I was too busy being happy with my skates to really consider any danger it might pose. And on top of that, I was with my tough old Nana, and nothing could ever hurt me so long as she was around. Or at least, that's what I thought. So as it rolls up alongside me and slows to a stop, I just carry on trying my very best to twirl on the spot with my skates. In fact, knowing me, I probably tried to show off a little given I had an impromptu audience. The next thing I know, the passenger side of the van opens, and a very, very tall man steps out. I know everyone is tall when you have yet to hit 10 years old, but this guy probably towered over all the other grown-ups he was around, too. He was skinny to boot. He looked like a scarecrow and a skeleton's love child or something. Just all gangly limbs with a shock of salt and pepper hair, messily strewn across his scalp. He approaches me and asks me which way the highway is, and I just pointed back down the street. I am not even sure that was the right direction, but I sure as heck wanted to be helpful to a stranger. I remember he smiled and thanked me, and it was only then that I started to get nervous. It was his teeth. They were all discolored and crooked. I think most kids associate monsters with their teeth. Maybe most adults do too. I know I certainly do. And seeing that guy's teeth put the fear of God into me. But I tried to stay polite when he asked me how my Christmas went, showing him my new skates when he asked me what Santa had brought me that year. It was then that he told me that Santa had been extra generous to him and his family that year, and had brought his daughter so many presents that she didn't even want all of them. Now, my family has always been close-knit, loving and generous with their money. They just never had a lot of it, so holidays for us were always pretty sparse affairs. which is why, when the Scarecrow Man told me his daughter got so much that she didn't even want some of her presents, I couldn't quite believe my ears. And when he actually offered me a Barbie-themed dollhouse, one I actually really did want, I almost forgot about how nervous I was of him. It wasn't enough to completely shake the fear out of me, though. So when he told me he had it in the back of the van, asking me if I'd like to come take a look, I just started skating away from him, shaking my head, silently. But instead of just shrugging it off and getting back into his van, he starts to follow me back towards my parents' place, asking if it was where I lived, if my parents were home, that kind of stuff. We hadn't had any stranger danger lessons in school, so it was only out of pure instinct that I unlatched the gate to my parents' place and began to wail for my Nana. No sooner had I let out the second cry than my Nana appears with this big old cast iron pan in her hand and comes tearing up the path towards me and what I know now to be my potential abductor, and she's screaming bloody murder as she does so. I didn't see this at the time, but from what my mom told me years later, at my Nana's funeral, this guy takes one look at Nana, fills his britches, and just bugs the heck out of there as she chases his van up the street. I do remember seeing her swinging that pan around and telling him to come back so she could beat him black and blue, and as much as her display of furiousness freaked me out, I was just grateful she could be twice as scary as Scarecrow Man had been. The way my mom tells it, Nana had tried to get the van's tag number, only to find it didn't have one. The guy was a predator, through and through, and had obviously been prepping and gearing up to kidnap someone, for whatever reason that may be. Next thing I know, the cops are at our house. My dad has come home early from work, and I am having to tell people over and over again what the guy looked like, while they write things down and ask me a zillion questions about the color of the van, the guy's clothes, like every little detail you could possibly think of. Needless to say, I didn't get to go out on my skates again for the rest of the holidays. So like I mentioned, this whole story came up at my Nana's funeral when we were telling tales about her. And the one really freaky thing about the whole incident, and something I didn't know until years and years after, was that when me and Nana described the Scarecrow Man to the cops, they both shot each other a look like, holy crap, before telling Nana and my dad that we had pretty much just described another one of their perps to them, to a T. We had described a guy that had made several other attempts at kidnapping kids in broad daylight over the holiday period. A guy they were desperate to get their hands on, because they knew it was just a matter of time before his luck turned, and he managed to trick a kid into getting into the van. Knowing I could well have been dead before my 10th birthday, having endured unimaginable torment before I was finally put out of my misery. It's something that makes my skin crawl, even to this day. Near Central California, there's an old mining community that you've probably heard of called the Mother Lode. It's an area of California that was a large part of the gold rush. That is where this story takes place. On the way out of town, down a long road almost like a stretch of highway, you suddenly veer off to the right and go down a rough, older road less than a quarter mile down. The road dead ends into a circle parking area with a gate at the end, which is kept locked by the city. If you were to go past the gate, you would end up at a popular lake in my area. When you park at the end, you are basically surrounded on one side by steep hills dotted with poison oak and tall pine and oak trees. The other side is a steep downhill slope to the lake. So basically, you are in a bowl. We were told that if we were to go up to the left, up the steep hill, that there would be an old mine, long abandoned by the miners that the county didn't close. About 250 feet up the steep hill, We found the old mine, almost hidden in a slight divot in the hillside that you wouldn't see unless you walked right up on it. To get into the mine, you had to climb down a slight slope into the ground and go over some medium-sized rocks on the ground, leftovers from when they blasted into the mountain. The mine itself was about 7 feet tall and 6 feet wide, which formed a tunnel that was about 250 feet into the mountain. The mine had rough rock walls with a colorful vein running along the left wall. This vein is said to indicate the presence of gold by its ribbons of colors. The tunnel followed along that vein, taking at least 2 turns with a couple of short, dead-ended offshoots. As you got deeper into the mine, you had to step carefully to avoid mud, which is what the old ore cart tracks were handy for. Ore carts hauled blasted rocks out of the mine on like mini railroad tracks. Once you were inside the mine, it was completely and utterly dark and silent, except for the sounds of the wind howling and dripping water. We took our time walking into the dark tunnel until we eventually reached the tunnel's end, a wall of solid rock. Disappointed, we started on the way back to the entrance. My buddy decided to stop near the entrance to chip some sample rock from the vein in the wall. He promised to be quick, so I just stood and waited for him. I maybe stood there for a couple of minutes before I heard the first strange sound. It sounded like a small pile of rocks toppling over, echoing up the shaft towards us. I tried to tell my buddy what I just heard, but he didn't hear me, so I just let it go. Not even 2 minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. This time, I got his attention to tell him what I just heard, but he just thought I was being paranoid. He said, "You're just hearing an echo from me." I tried to take his word for it, but again, not even 2 minutes later, there it was again. That time, the sound came with a feeling of panic and fear. That was when I literally just said, "You only have to be faster than your slowest friend." Then I just took off running, over the rocks and out of the mine. When he came out a few minutes later, he said he walked back to the end and didn't see any fallen rocks. I didn't go back there until a few years later with another buddy of mine. Same as before. Up the steep hill we went. The mine looked exactly as it did before, front to back, with no signs of a cave-in. Just as my other buddy had done before, my buddy just had to stop on the way out to chip away at that vein, winding along the left wall. As I was standing there waiting, I heard another strange, scary sound. But that time, it sounded like a rattle, and we both heard it. The only way we could describe it was it sounded just like a baby rattle. We both froze and looked at each other, puzzled and anxious, illuminated in each other's headlamps. Not even a couple minutes later, we both heard it again. The sound of a baby rattle. We both grew up here, so we knew it wasn't a rattlesnake or anything, which are common here. When we heard it the third time, the creepy feeling came right back to me, and I just ran out of there as fast as I could, practically tripping on the rocks on the way out. I haven't gone back since. I can't describe it. Something about that old mine just came with a bad, scary feeling, and both people that went there with me felt it as well. An acquaintance of mine, who happened to have been a cop, once told me this little tale he experienced several years ago. Back then, he was a deputy and still new to the patrol scene. Since he was new to it, he got called often to more simple tasks, tasks that made the more experienced deputies' jobs easier. One night, the deputy got a request over his radio to sit on a suicide scene. The victim was still inside the home, and they needed the deputy to sit and guard the main entry to the home until the coroner got there to take the body. They didn't want any relatives or anyone else to enter the scene and mess up evidence. Basically, that was a standard procedure. So the deputy got to the home of the suicide victim and confirmed with the cops already on the scene that he was there to wait for the coroner. It was the middle of the night, so the deputy grabbed his flip phone out of the patrol car and settled on the front porch to play some Snake. All was totally quiet around him after everyone else left. All the deputy could hear were the occasional sounds of distant barking dogs and the faint sounds of the sparse highway traffic. The silence did indeed make him a little nervous, especially considering what lay only a few feet away and invisible to him only because of a wall. So it was only natural that his instincts had his ears on high alert. So he was startled when he suddenly thought he heard a rustling sound, seemingly coming from inside the house behind him. All he could do was sit there and wait and listen intently. A few minutes went by though, and he didn't hear anything else. So he just figured he probably heard the house settling or something. Over half an hour went by, and the deputy was starting to get a little drowsy staring at Snake on his small flip phone. So he flipped it shut and sat back for a few minutes to relax. But then suddenly, there was that sound again, which seemed louder this time. A strange rustling sound, like maybe rustling papers, he thought to himself, puzzled. As he sat there and listened hard, he heard it again. And that time he was sure it was coming from inside the house behind him, where the victim was. At that point, the deputy admits he was pretty scared. He didn't want to call for backup until he was sure there was someone inside the house. But he also didn't want to go inside the dark, creepy death scene by himself to investigate either. So he stood up and waited once again for any noise, while resting his hand on the weapon in his belt. Then, the deputy drew his weapon as a loud sound from behind him caused him to spin around and face a large window by the front door, covered by vertical hanging blinds. As he turned around to face the window, an explosion of movement disturbed the vertical blinds. The deputy did admit to me in telling of this story that he did in fact definitely jump and scream, as most anyone would. The deputy's vision quickly cleared, and he stared at the face on the other side of the window, definitely not expecting to see that particular face staring back at him. The deputy screamed and went wide-eyed. The face staring back at him made a startled sound and went wide-eyed as well. Then, for a quiet moment, man and feline eyed each other before both turning away, feeling stupid. I guess the victim had a pet cat, which ended up most likely going to a relative of the victim's. The deputy admitted to me after telling me this story that he felt it was one of the scariest instances he had ever had in his entire career. I wasn't as scared as I should have been, but my fear gene is broken, and I had been drinking, so... We have a lake less than an hour from home, and my daughter's friend had never been camping. So we decided to do a quick overnight there. We, mom and daughter, 18 then, camp a lot and like the solitude, so we often try to find the most remote places. No campsite or anything, just drive up and find a space. So we found this nice little peninsula big enough for about 3 campsites, and it being Sunday, we were hoping the other 2 groups would leave. They did eventually, and we had the place very much to ourselves. As the night goes on, we have a nice fire, sing, laugh, I'm drinking wine, we're making s'mores. Everything is perfect until we go to sleep. About an hour in, the girls are bugging me to wake up because it's raining, and we need to put the cover on the tent. It was a huge tent, so all hands were needed. By now, the wind is blowing, and we're struggling, but we finally get it covered, and it's back to sleep we go. Until a motorcycle, more specifically, a dirt bike, at about 2 a.m., just riding circles around the peninsula. Mind you, this is literally a small enough area that only 3 large tents plus 3 cars would fit, and there's nothing else nearby but bushes and the lake. There would be no reason to be there, as it was obvious we were alone. Up, down, around, and stop, never cutting the engine. I just want to sleep, so I go to the front of the tent and unzip it. I look outside and see him just staring, so I climb out of the tent and stare back. It's dark, and I can't tell if this creep can even see me, so I go back in the tent, frustrated. The girls ask what he's doing, and when I tell them, they get really frightened. I tell them I'm gonna go give him a piece of my mind. They are terrified, demand that I don't leave the tent. So I settle back in and wait. Up, around, circle, engine rev, idle, over and over. This guy goes on for at least another hour. I've had it. Down, up, around with all that annoying, blatting motocross sound blasting by our tent back and forth and stop. I look out. He's staring again. I'm about to go stomping over to go tell him off when I get the tingles all down my spine. He was facing directly towards our tent, saying nothing, just still and staring. I realize I have no weapons, no way to protect the girls, and he's between us and the car. I wait. I'm outside the tent, but I haven't made a move forward because now instinct and logic have the better of me, and I realize that an aggressive approach is probably the wrong move. I stay stock still just like the rider for what felt like an eternity, both of us staring. Must have been 20 minutes I stood there. And then just like that, he took off, drove off the peninsula and out of earshot, and never came back. To this day, I'll never know what that was about, or if I did the right thing. I can only say I'm glad I never confronted him. My gut just told me no. As for my daughter and I think I need to buy a weapon if we're going to camp alone like this again. I was 22 and lived in my parents' house while they had left South Africa to work abroad. My grandmother moved in with me to help out as I was a single mother while still studying in university. In the end, we helped each other because she was also on oxygen due to chronic lung disease. Growing up in South Africa, we are taught from a very young age that it's important to make sure all doors are locked and windows are closed at night. Being a very private person, I would always have my curtains closed. People can be extremely nosy here. Well, one night after a long day of studies and simply being a mom, we locked all the doors and shut the windows, pulling all the curtains closed to settle in for the night. Now, my son was not a great sleeper and would often wake up throughout the night. After dozing off, later that evening he woke me up asking for his bottle, and I decided to check the time, slightly blinded by the TV's light. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. 10 p.m. Something wasn't right. I felt like we weren't alone. As I peered through the doorway into the passage, I could have sworn I saw a dark shadow almost crawling across the tiled floor. I'm imagining things. I must be. Shrugging it off, I pass my son his bottle. Still, I swear I'm hearing sounds, like someone coming up the stairs this time, but that's in the opposite direction. The railing creaks, and I'm about to get out of my bed to check, when a face peeks around the corner of my bedroom door. Gran, is that you? Expecting her to be needing help with something, so I reached for my phone to create light, as I had already switched the TV off again. A man storms into my room and grabs my phone before I can hide it. I'm in so much shock Yet I know exactly what is going on at that moment. "Take whatever you want. Please, just don't hurt us," I say calmly. He puts his index finger to his lips. Shh. He's just standing there as though he is waiting and watching guard. Then suddenly, 3 other men rush in and ask question after question. Where's the safe? Where's the weapons? Where's this and that? They were all armed, and I had no idea what they had planned for us. I just couldn't keep up, trying to answer all their questions. Why would I, a single mother in a house with her child and grandmother, have a weapon? In all honesty, I've never even owned one. They took everything, and then insisted on taking my car keys. I tried telling them I couldn't remember where I had put them, but they stuck a weapon in my 2-year-old son's face and asked again, "Where are the keys?" So I told them where I thought I had left them. After going through all my things, taking what they wanted, and were then ready to leave, I'm presuming they were throwing everything into my car for the getaway. The one guy chose to stick around in my room a little longer. "Give me a kiss," he whispered. "Oh no," I was shouting in my mind, still trying to stay composed. He put out his hand and took mine. Then the others called for him, and as he pulled away, I dug my nails into his hand and scratched. If I was going to do anything, I was going to get DNA off one of them. If no one could see what was going on in my home, I would find a way to get justice. "Don't scream," they said, and ran down the stairs. I ran down after them and screamed as loud as I could for help from the neighbors as they sped off in my car. Standing outside in the pitch black, calling for anyone to help us. And yet no one heard. It felt like hours had passed. No phones, no laptops, no means of contact. They took everything, and I couldn't even call my parents. To this day, these men have never been caught, and I wonder, if I had my curtains open, perhaps someone might have seen. People were still awake. I am now 35, and since that night, I refuse to go to sleep without my curtains open and at least one light on. This happened in 2004. I was a new college graduate starting my career in healthcare at a hospital 2 hours away from where I grew up. The hospital I worked at was huge, a level 1 trauma center. I work in a highly specialized area. There were only 2 other people at the hospital with my licensure. That's important because we spent a lot of time working alone in our department and had to stagger our shifts for coverage. I had the early shift. I arrived at 5:45 in the morning. Staff parking was several city blocks away from the hospital, and they sent a shuttle to pick employees up. The lot was surrounded by an urban forest. The city tried to leave as much green space and trees as possible. There was nothing else near the parking lot at the time. Since I arrived so early, the shuttle service had to be called when I arrived. The call button was located at the shuttle stop, meaning you had to leave your car to communicate with the dispatch. I was always creeped out because, even though there were parked cars, there were never any employees in the lot at the time I came in. The overnight shift didn't change until 7 a.m. A few weeks after I started working there, I had settled into the shuttle routine and gotten more comfortable. At this time, cell phone service was spotty at best, and I didn't own a smartphone, so it wasn't very reliable. One afternoon, when I returned to my car, I found a note left on my windshield. It read, "Hot and sweet you are." I glanced around and didn't see anyone. I was perplexed, but not really frightened. Another week passed. I forgot about the note until one afternoon I returned to my car and found a flower in the windshield wiper and another note. This one read, "I really love your dimples. I could make you smile." What the heck? I had just moved to this town and didn't have any friends beyond the other 2 people in my department. I didn't know anyone else. I did feel creeped out this time and began feeling like I was being watched or something. Early in the mornings, I would park as close to the shuttle stop as possible, buzz the dispatch, and then wait in my car with the doors locked. I often imagined I heard shuffling noises like shoes scraping through the gravel, and I couldn't see all the way to the dark corners of the lot. When I returned to my car in the afternoons, I carried my pepper spray just in case. I told my coworkers about the notes, and they told me I should tell security. I felt a little silly, but I made a report. Security said they would keep an eye out, whatever that meant. I stopped parking in that lot, opting instead to find parking on the street nearer to the hospital where there were other people around. Things went fine for the next few weeks, until one day I got another note. This time, it was on my car one morning, outside my apartment building. In the same scribbly handwriting, it simply read, "Don't be shy." I was so confused. What did this person want? Obviously, they were following me, and now they knew where I lived, and probably knew I lived alone. I contacted the police. There wasn't much they could do, but they did make some safety recommendations and said they would patrol the neighborhood more often. I took a self-defense class and was hyper-aware of my surroundings. It was worse not knowing who I was dealing with. A few weeks later, a woman was found assaulted and murdered in the trees behind the employee parking lot. They caught the guy a couple days later. I recognized him. He was a contract painter who had been working in my area. The hospital had been remodeling our department, and this painter would come in early, around 6:30 a.m. I made coffee every morning in the break room, and he would come in to get a cup. We made small talk a few times, but never any red flags. Then it came back to me. Sometimes he would call me Dimples. I shivered. "Good morning, Dimples." I was shocked that he had literally been right under my nose for weeks. I had been totally alone with him on many occasions, and I never suspected anything. I don't know for certain that he was the one leaving the notes, but they stopped after he was arrested. Anyway, stay safe out there, guys and gals. On the morning after Thanksgiving of 2003, the snow-covered winter wonderland that was the Horn Creek Conference Center in Westcliff, Colorado, made for a peaceful and serene setting. But that peace was to be shattered when the naked corpse of a young woman was found lying frozen in the snow just outside one of the guest cabins. The young woman's name was Natalie Drissel. Natalie was 20 years old when she was found dead, having grown in her native Missouri, then moving to the state of Florida to attend college. During the summer of 2003, Natalie had taken a job working at the Horn Creek Conference Center during a Christian summer camp event that was being held there. It was here that she met her boyfriend, who had a full-time job there, and it was during the Thanksgiving break of 2003 that she decided to make the journey back up to Colorado to visit him, with the couple opting to stay in separate guest cabins for the duration of their trip, given the pious nature of their location. The couple spent Thanksgiving together, taking romantic walks around the snow-covered campgrounds, hand in hand. Afterwards, Natalie's boyfriend dropped her off back at the cabin shortly after midnight of Friday, November 28th, so that she could get some rest. But the next morning, The boyfriend went back to the very same cabin to check up on her, yet found she wasn't there. He looked around a little and was disturbed to find footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin, ones that had obviously been made by someone's bare feet, given the shape and size. This must have sent him into a panic, wondering what could have frightened his girlfriend so much that she fled into the freezing night in nothing but her bare feet. He followed the tracks for a short while into a wooded area around 200 yards from the camp's conference building, before finding her body lying in the snow at around 8:50 a.m. But Natalie wasn't just barefoot. She was completely naked. Her exposed arms and legs were all scratched up and bruised, and by the time her boyfriend found her body, rigor mortis had set in. She was completely stiff, like a wax model, and it must have been extremely traumatizing for him to see someone he loved so dearly in such a terrible state. Custer County Sheriff Fred Jobe said there was only a single set of prints that had led them to Natalie's body, meaning she had not been pursued by anyone in the moments before her death. He also said that the pattern of her footprints appeared to be erratic, as she had been wandering through the area in a daze before she had collapsed. It was also judged that, given the state of rigor mortis she was in, that she had actually died very soon after being dropped off back at the cabin, maybe only 15 to 20 minutes after the boyfriend had departed. An autopsy was performed over at the El Paso County Coroner's Office on November 30th, with the conclusion being that Natalie appeared to have been in a completely healthy state before she had died. Given that there were pine needles in her hair, with dirt and abrasions on her face and shoulder, and coupled with the chaotic patterning among her footprints, it appeared that Natalie had actually run into one or two trees as she fled her cabin. Evidence of such injuries included, among other things, linear scratches on her forehead, cheeks, neck, chest, abdomen, and legs. Small contusions just above the trachea on her right cheek and to the right of her chin, and purple contusions on her left forearm, hand, and wrist. Other than evidence of injuries, which the coroner believed were consistent with running through trees and brush, she had no visible external injuries. It is also interesting to note that the autopsy showed that there were no internal injuries to her brain, so we can safely rule out there being some kind of hemorrhage or tumor being to blame for Natalie's strange behavior. While the autopsy did not determine the cause of death, Sheriff Jobe said, "They've ruled out anything criminal. It's just really, really weird. But we're still hoping to find out something more conclusive." Lee Roybal, officer in charge of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, also commented on the unusual nature of Natalie's death, saying, "It's the strangest thing you've ever seen." Although there could be no definitive answers as to why or how Natalie had died, the coroner was forced to conclude that she had ultimately died from a phenomenon known as excited delirium. She had absolutely no traces of narcotics or alcohol in her system when she died, and despite not being able to give a concrete conclusion that she had died of excited delirium, listed 6 main factors that had caused him to reach such a decision. The first and main point being that she had been found completely naked, having not been obviously pursued by anyone. There were also no internal injuries at all, so no obvious way of telling how she had died. There was also the complete lack of narcotics in her system, so there was no way a drug could be to blame for the erratic state she was in that evening. There was also the possibility that, given she was a recent arrival to a relatively high altitude from sea level Florida, that a lack of oxygen in her brain could be to blame for the delirium. On top of all this, there was an elevated amount of glucose in her urine. As has been stated, there could be no concrete conclusions as to how Natalie had died, but there was much rumor and speculation in the days that followed. For example, there was a great deal of attention paid to her boyfriend, given that he was a natural suspect, having been the past person to see Natalie alive, as well as the person who found her corpse first. Yet Natalie's family did not and still do not believe that her boyfriend had anything to do with her untimely death. There was also a great amount of conjecture regarding a supposed eating disorder that Natalie had been dealing with, and that the cardiac arrest she suffered was a direct result of malnutrition. Given the mysterious circumstances and a plethora of different theories put forward to explain Natalie's death, it is almost impossible to decide on a definitive explanation as to how or why she passed away. What's clear is that she had absolutely no history of mental illness, had no history of drug use, and was in perfect health right up until that Thanksgiving weekend. Yet suddenly, she appears to have had some kind of psychotic break for no obvious reason at all. One moment, her boyfriend was dropping her back at the guest cabin, and she was perfectly normal. The next, she was stripped naked, and she was sprinting through the snow-covered woods in the dark at such a speed that she collided with tree trunks as she ran, with the whole episode ending in her dropping dead just a few hundred yards away from where she was staying. We have to admit, the situation is truly and terrifyingly bizarre, with the information at hand raising many more questions than answers. Although the coroner gave the explanation of excited delirium, it has proved to be a controversial diagnosis. The condition known as excited delirium is not recognized by the World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association, or the American Medical Association, and therefore not listed a medical condition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The UK Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody suggests that the syndrome should be termed sudden death in restraint syndrome in order to enhance clarity. Examples of deaths due to the condition are found primarily in restraint or attempted restraint situations, while medical preconditions and symptoms attributed to the syndrome are far more varied. In which case, can we even place any credence in such an explanation? And if we dismiss it entirely, we are left with a gaping hole in Natalie's story in trying to explain just how she lost her life. But still, is it possible that Natalie encountered someone or something in or around that cabin that gave her such a fright that it could have triggered a highly panicked state that could have been confused with so-called excited delirium? And if so, just what was it that she encountered? Could it have been some kind of twilight creeper who posed such a terrifying threat that Natalie abandoned all reason and logic, deciding it was better to run naked into the snow in order to escape such a threat? Or perhaps it was something far worse. A large, wild, aggressive animal, perhaps, that wasn't about to display the same kind of subtlety and was about to smash its way into the cabin to devour her. It's unclear what caused such a state of fear that night. But one thing is clear in abundance, that we will never know exactly what happened to Natalie Drissel, and that we'll have to accept that here we are, walking the earth, knowing that at any moment, we too could simply fall down dead from some mysterious ailment that leaves our loved ones as baffled as they are heartbroken. I live in Belgium, and I'm currently 21 years old. These events took place when I was around 8 to 12 years old. My grandparents used to live in an older home in the countryside, not too far from the city. At first glance, this house was amazing. It had a yard surrounding the entirety of the property, and me and my cousins used to play there a lot. It had a fishing pond with koi fish in the back, a huge walnut tree on the side, and lots of space to play around in. Lots of our family parties took place in this house, and we visited with my parents every Wednesday for lunch to eat my grandmother's amazing pancakes. It was an older home, and we used to sleep over there quite frequently. I don't remember much of my nights there, but there were some things that always creeped me out about this house. To paint a picture, the house had two entrances, one in the front which I never witnessed anyone using, and the door in the back that came into the kitchen. In the kitchen, you had an open doorway going into the living room right in front of the back door entrance, and on the right, a long hallway. All the way at the end of the hallway was the playroom, a room full of toys and games where we used to spend most of the time during family parties when we weren't playing in the yard. My grandparents' bedrooms were on the ground floor right next to the wooden stairs. The first floor had 2 guest rooms, one right to the left of the stairs, with one regular bed and a bunk bed, and one all the way to the right of the stairs with a king-sized bed. You also had a bathroom diagonally of the stairs, and in the guest room to the left, you had a door that led into a small room. To start off this story, we'll talk about the small room in the back of the guest room. This door was always locked. My grandfather used to tell us this room should not under any circumstance be entered without his permission, and I have only seen the inside once when he went to grab some old things from my father when I was still a child. Me and my sister used to sleep in this guest room whenever we would sleep over, and most nights were uneventful. Though for a reason I can't seem to explain, this house always gave me the creeps. At first, I thought it was because it's such an old home, and I've always been a person with a vivid imagination. However, after a while, it became apparent my intuition wasn't as far off as I thought it was. Many things took place in this house, and I will try to keep it as chronological as possible. The first thing I remember being relatively freaked out by was when my grandparents' cat, Tom, died after a long, relaxing life. I was laying on the couch with him and petting him, as I used to do so many times during my stays. He was a cuddly and fat cat, truly a beauty, but at this point, he was as old, if not older than I was. As I was petting him, I put my hand on his stomach while watching TV, and subconsciously matched my breathing to his. This is when I noticed I was getting lightheaded trying to keep up with his breathing. It was as if he was hyperventilating. Concerned, I told my grandmother something was wrong with Tom. I explained what I noticed, and she assured me she would take him to the vet. I slept over that night and woke up early in the morning. When I came downstairs, I walked through the long hallway going into the kitchen for breakfast, as my grandparents always made sure we had something to eat when we woke up. As I was walking, I saw both my grandparents to the bathroom to my left, right before the door to the kitchen. They were squatting down, and I went in to see what was happening. To my surprise, they looked at me concerned, and I glanced over at what they were doing. It was Tom. He was in a basket, not moving. My first thought would have been that he was sleeping like he always did, but judging by the look on my grandparents' faces, I figured out quickly what had happened. Tom had died during the night. Of course, I realized this could be a freaky coincidence, but looking back, I don't know if it was. The reason I say this is because this is when the scary things started to happen. Not long after, I started to see a woman in a white dress in the corner of my eyes, walking into the bathroom Tom died in when I would be passing the hallway. I was a scared child, so I never had the guts to walk in after her to see if I just imagined it. I would just run to someone as fast as I could in order to feel safe, and I knew no one would believe me. I never mentioned it to anyone, not even my sister, who used to sleep over with me and is only 2 years older. I didn't want to seem paranoid or like I had been crying for attention or something. I started running down this hallway as fast as I could whenever no one was around to see me, as I was scared of it by now. I slept over less because I no longer felt comfortable in this house, and made sure to always have someone around when I was there. However, there would be times when we'd have no choice but to sleep over, or when I would forget for a split second how scared I was, and agreed to sleep over. My grandparents are amazing people, and I love them with all my heart. If they asked me to sleep over, saying no would be close to impossible for me. My sister and I slept in the guest room with the locked door. We would often sleep in the bunk beds together. I didn't feel very scared with her. I have always felt like she was protecting me as a child, and even now as a young adult. On a few occasions, as my sister would be fast asleep, I would hear sounds coming from the room behind the locked door. I remember once I thought someone tried opening it from the other side, and it scared the bejesus out of me. I just went under the covers as I always did in order to feel safe. I think everyone has at some point. Often I would fall asleep afterward, with no more sounds or scares. Some time had passed between my nightly stays at my grandparents', and for the first time in a few weeks, I decided to sleep over again. My sister wasn't with me this time. I was going to be spending the night alone, which in hindsight creeped me out. Reminding myself of what had happened in the past, I thought I would sleep in the other guest room that night. My grandparents, though surprised, happily readied the big bed for me to sleep in. Night came around, and I was relaxed in bed trying to fall asleep. As I was drifting to sleep, I suddenly felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I heard tapping on the window behind the closed blinds. This room was on the side of the big tree in the yard, so I shook it off thinking it was a branch hitting the window and closed my eyes again. However, the tapping continued. 1 tap, 2, 3, silence. A few seconds passed. 1 tap, 2, 3, silence. I started to get skeptical. Why would a branch hit the window at a set pattern? It didn't make sense. If it was the wind that caused the branch to move, wouldn't it be random? I stood up, pushed aside the curtain to look outside, and saw nothing at first. For a second I felt relieved nothing was on the other side. But then I realized the tree. It's a few meters or a few feet from the window. There is no branch that would be able to hit it, even with a good amount of wind. I couldn't make sense of it, so I looked around for anything that would cause this noise. Nothing would be able to hit this window so high up, not to mention the intervals of the taps. It was too regular. It had to be done on purpose. I got scared. I ran back to my bed and hid under the covers again, but not even a minute later, the tapping started again. At this point, I was crying. The more taps I heard, the louder I became until I started yelling "stop" as loud as I could. My grandparents ran upstairs and came into the room super concerned. The tapping had stopped. They saw how upset I was, hugging me and asking me what happened. I said something was outside my window, but to no one's surprise, there was nothing there. My grandfather decided it would be better if I slept with him tonight, and my grandmother decided to sleep in this room. After calming down, I slept peacefully. In the morning, they tried asking me again what had happened. I told them something scared me by tapping on the window, and as I initially figured, they said it must have been the tree outside. Too ashamed of myself, I just agreed with them, ready to forget it ever happened. Fast forward a few months. I hadn't slept over at the house for quite a while, and it was time for me and my sister to spend another night there. At this point, I kind of forgot how scary it could be, and to no surprise, that seemed to be my downfall. As a side note, I have always been an insomniac, spending hours falling asleep sometimes. Never once in my stays have I heard my grandparents' bedroom door at the bottom of the stairs open after they went to bed. In the middle of the night, it must have been around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming up the wooden creaking stairs that stopped at the top. The open door to the bedroom was immediately to the left of these stairs, so whoever was walking up had to take one more step towards the doorway to be visible from where I was laying. My sister, snoring in the top bunk, didn't seem to be bothered by this, but I was scared out of my mind. My grandparents would at least show themselves to us, to look in, to check in on us. But there was no one in the doorway. No more sounds. We always kept the light on in the hallway, so anyone that would even try to peek in would be obvious. But there was no such thing. It felt like an eternity, but after a few minutes, I started to calm down, blaming my vivid imagination, and decided to go back to sleep. A few hours afterward, I woke up again, this time with a full bladder. Being half asleep, I forgot what transpired earlier, and gladly stood up to go to the bathroom. I did my thing, washed my hands, and walked out of the bathroom. As I was walking towards the room, I noticed from the corner of my eyes my sister in the mirror above the sink looking back at me from the reflection. I remember thinking I just hadn't seen her pass me as I was washing my hands or something, and went back to my room. To my horror, I saw my sister on the top bunk, sleeping like a baby. Then it hit me. What had transpired earlier. My heart sank. I threw the door shut and locked the door, terrified like a deer that had just seen a tiger in the distance. I just stood there, not knowing whether I should wake someone, scream, whatever I had to do to get rid of this pit I had in my stomach. I couldn't fathom what had happened on this night. I just sat at the door for what felt like hours trying to make sense of it. Once the sun started coming up, I felt less scared. I was so tired, I just decided to lay in my bed. I couldn't sleep though, and in the early morning, I heard my grandparents' door open and decided to go downstairs. I needed company, conscious company at least. I didn't tell anyone again, not until a few years later. I never slept there again. I didn't feel safe there anymore, and to me, sleeping there was like having a nightmare. I found excuse after excuse not to stay, until my grandparents finally moved out. The house was getting too expensive for them, and it was too much to keep it clean and in a good state. So they moved to a small house not too far from my uncle to be able to spend more time with their children and grandchildren. They are happy there and live quite comfortably. I slept over there once, luckily without any problems, but deep down, I am always on edge being alone in the home of my grandparents, and never feel truly comfortable there. I loved that old house. Our family made a lot of memories there, and it was super fun to play in and around the home with my cousins. But never in my life would I want to spend another night in that godforsaken place. On December 14th, 2014, a teenage boy is exploring the woods around the back roads of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, around 30 feet from the nearest path. It is a quiet, rarely traveled area where the nearest tarmacked road is just under a mile away, one that cuts through a residential area that hosts only around a dozen or so homes, with minimal traffic, little more than a locally known shortcut to and from Route 989. The young lad is in a world of his own, enjoying the peace and tranquility of nature, completely unaware of what he is about to stumble across. He only spots what he is about to discover because it looks extremely out of place. Even among the death and decay of the Pennsylvania winter, the thing has a distinct air of morbidity about it. When he recognizes what it is, he turns on his heels and runs screaming from the woods, tears in his eyes, his heart racing in his chest, because what he had discovered that gray December day was a severed head. Only this wasn't the disembodied head of a newly murdered person. This particular head had been embalmed, preserved. When the police finally arrived hours later, they discovered that the eyes of the severed head were shut, but the mouth was wide open. They intensively searched the surrounding area for any signs of the body it had once been attached to, but found nothing. The head was so well preserved that its face was still definitively recognizable, but a subsequent facial reconstruction yielded no clues to the owner's identity. Forensic examiners estimated that it had been there for between 1 week and a month, just lying there among the fallen leaves, waiting to be discovered. If the gray hairs that covered her scalp were anything to go by, it was thought that the owner of the severed head was anything from 50 to 80 years of age. An anatomy professor turned forensic artist by the name of Michel Vitali examined the head in excruciating detail by request of the local police department. After hours upon hours of study, she came to a shocking conclusion: that whoever had severed the head had done so with the skill of an expert pathologist, that they must have had some kind of anatomical training to have completed the task with such precision. A conclusion shockingly reminiscent of the world-famous 19th century serial killer, Jack the Ripper. When we lifted the skin flap at the nape of the neck, we could see that the whole purpose of that was to access the key joint that would preserve both the head and the vertebral column, she told local news reporters during a horrifying interview. This is not anybody going with a kitchen knife or anything remotely like that. It was well done, and it was placed perfectly. She was dismembered professionally. Another piece of evidence that supported the theory that whoever had severed the head had done so with professional skill was the use of what are known as eye caps, a common mortician's tool. These are devices that reassemble contact lenses and are worn in a chillingly similar way. They slip between the eyeball and the eyelid of the deceased person and are complete with small ridges or spikes that main the natural curvature of the eye, whilst holding the eyelids shut. The pathologists who examined the embalmed head removed these eye caps and found that the person's eyeballs had been removed, but also made a disturbing discovery. The eyeballs had been replaced with small, red, rubber bouncy balls, the kind a child might play with. Whoever had done such a thing obviously had a sick sense of humor and was undoubtedly a very dangerously disturbed individual. After the initial forensic analysis, the embalmed head was sent over to Salt Lake City-based IsoForensics, who undertook isotope testing on it. For those unfamiliar with the technique, isotopes are particles that can be found in the human body that come from drinking water that can be traced back to a particular geographical location. When the results of the isotope testing came back, investigators were able to conclude that the woman had spent the previous several months being something of a nomad, having lived, or at least stayed, in areas including West Virginia, Western Maryland, Southern Pennsylvania, and even as far as Eastern Ohio and New York State. Yet despite there being evidence to the owner of the severed head having lived in so many places, there was little to show that she had ever lived in Beaver County during time leading up to her death or discovered. However, the use of embalming fluid meant that determining the exact time of death was almost impossible. It also made DNA matching next to impossible, as the fluid destroyed nucleotide bonds that enabled such analysis to be undertaken. The small amount that was obtained was so damaged that it could not be matched to any other samples in the national database. But much to the relief of those involved with the analysis, it was discovered that there was no criminal element to her death, that the cardiac arrest was the most likely explanation for her demise. This was due to toxicology tests that had shown that there were trace amounts of lidocaine and atropine in her system, which are both varieties of medication that are used to treat irregular heart issues. Most likely a cardiac arrest, but not completely confirmed. One homicide detective was said to have been extremely skeptical that the owner of the embalmed head had died of natural causes, having seen far too many cases in which the possessiveness of the killer was displayed in their willingness to tamper and toy with the body of their quarry. When interviewed by journalists, Beaver County Coroner Terry Tatalovich Rossi said, "Could it have been someone with a great deal of anatomical knowledge? Yes. Could it have been someone who is just peculiar or bizarre? The answer to that question is also yes. We just don't know at this point." Michael O'Brien, the borough police chief, claimed the embalmed head was found so far off the road that it was entirely possible that it could have been simply thrown from a passing car. It was also determined that the scent and flavor of the embalming fluid would have made the flesh very unappealing to scavenger animals, so there was little chance it had been dropped by some hungry fox. The placement was deliberate. Someone had wanted it to be found, sooner or later. A number of funeral homes that associated with the Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association were contacted with pleas for information, and details of the bizarre case were even shared at a National Funeral Directors Association conference. But unsurprisingly, no one could shed any light of the gruesome situation. Every theory with the exception of grave robbery had been dismissed, with many agreeing that the most likely explanation is that the owner of the embalmed head had been a victim of the black market trade that deals in the illegal acquisition of human remains, either for professional or recreational purposes. There's a black market on body parts, and that market is pretty extensive, Beaver County District Attorney Anthony was reported to have said. Detectives have repeatedly stated that they believed the head may have been removed from the corpse of a natural cause death by what's known as a body broker, an individual or firm who purchases and sells cadavers or remains. One solid reason that this line of investigation is thought to be the most plausible is because the black market cadaver industry had been linked to similar abuses in the past. Due to the plethora of firms where you can purchase human remains, any attempt to discover where the severed head came from is, according to Professor Michelle Vitali, extremely hard to track. If the owner of the severed head is to ever be identified, it would almost certainly require the assistance of a dentist. The forensic investigation discovered that the owner of the severed head had work done on every single tooth, one of them as many as 7 times. On one of the 3 teeth that had been pulled, forensic dentists discovered a filling compound that wasn't available to dentists before 2004, indicating that the woman must have died after that particular year. So far, analysis of the woman's dental work had produced no leads, but with a forensic facial reconstruction, investigators still hope that someone, someday, will be able to identify the woman and give her name back. Almost 6 years later, we are still no closer to discovering the identity of whoever owned the embalmed head, or that of the sick individual who had severed or stolen it by replacing the eyeballs with red rubber balls. It might well remain a total mystery who exactly placed the head in the woods out in Pennsylvania. But perhaps the real question is, do we really want to know the whole story behind it? Or are we most likely able to sleep easier, remaining in blissful ignorance? In 2004, in the sleepy Chicago suburb of Aurora, Illinois, Amy Pitson would give birth to her firstborn son. After some deliberation, she and her husband James would name the boy Timothy. The first 6 years of the boy's life were happy and uneventful, and we have every reason to believe that he was loved and well looked after by his 2 young parents. He had an extensive collection of relatives that he visited regularly, who cared for the boy just as much as his own parents did. But Timothy and his family were headed towards a tragedy that would confound and puzzle all that became familiar with it. A mystery that would remain unsolved, even to this day. On the morning of May 11th, 2011, James Pitson woke up, made breakfast for himself and his son, and then drove the boy to his kindergarten class over at Greenman Elementary School on West Galena Boulevard before he headed to work. But for some reason, a short while later, just after 8 a.m., Amy Pitson arrived at the school, telling a member of the teaching staff that there was a family emergency and that she needed to take Timothy out of school for the day. Timothy's kindergarten teacher naturally obliged his mother, letting the young boy out of class to accompany her wherever she was headed, after wishing her the best with whatever emergency she was dealing with. However, instead of dealing with this apparent family emergency, Amy Pitson's whereabouts are unknown until around 10 a.m. that same morning, when she arrived at a vehicle repair shop in Aurora. A friendly employee of the shop then drove Pitson and her son over to the nearby Brookfield Zoo, where the pair then spent the remainder of the morning and the early afternoon relaxing and exploring the various animal exhibits that were on display there. At around 3 p.m., Amy and her son arrived back at the vehicle repair shop, collecting her car before driving over to the Key Lime Cove Resort in the small town of Gurnee, over in Lake County, which is known for its large water park, as well as being a subsidiary of Six Flags. After taking Timothy around the water park, Amy and her son spent the night at the resort, leaving early the next morning before driving over state lines to Wisconsin. Here they checked into Kalahari Resort in the Wisconsin Dells at around 10 a.m., both being recorded on CCTV cameras. But since then, neither hide nor hair of Timothy Pitson has been seen anywhere. For all intents and purposes, the young man had vanished into thin air. Around lunchtime the following day, on May 13th, Amy Pitson made a series of phone calls to some of her relatives, including her brother-in-law and her mother. She assured them that they were not to worry, how she and Timothy were both safe and well, and that neither of them were in any danger. These relatives would later confirm that Timothy was indeed present with his mother at the time of these calls, since he could be heard in the background, complaining that he was hungry. In the investigation that followed, cell phone records showed that the calls were made from an area close to Sterling, in Vernon County, Wisconsin, and that the pair were apparently on the move again, via Route 40. Yet contrary to what one might expect, Amy Pitson did not contact her husband, the one person you might assume she would call to inform of her and her son's whereabouts. James had been frantic with worry ever since the evening of May 11th, when he had returned home to find the house empty, and had subsequently heard the news that his wife had taken Timothy out of school. On the evening of May 13th, Amy Pitson was recorded on the security cameras of a Winnebago family dollar store. She was alone when she purchased a notebook, some stationery, and some envelopes. She was still all on her own when she was sighted at a branch of Sullivan's Food, also in Winnebago, Wisconsin, where she apparently visited the pharmacy counter before swiftly leaving. She was not spotted again until just past 11 that night, when she had apparently returned to Illinois, checking into a room at the Rockford Inn in the city of Rockford. The following day, in the early afternoon of May 14th, a member of the housekeeping staff at the inn visited the room that Amy Pitson was staying in, with the intention of cleaning the room. There was no "Do Not Disturb" sign present on the door handle, and when the housekeeper knocked, there was no reply from inside the room. So, against her better judgment, she unlocked the room and walked inside. There, to her absolute horror, she found Amy Pitson lying face up on the sheets that were soaked with blood. Pitson had taken an overdose of powerful antihistamines before slashing her own wrists. She had also apparently left a note on a nearby dresser, stating that she was well and truly sorry for the mess she had caused, but that Timothy would never be found. However, the note was quick to reassure those that read it that Timothy was in fact safe, with people who would care for him, but that it would be pointless to look for him since his new guardians had hidden him away and would never give him up. After being called, Police quickly arrived on the scene to shut off the hotel room for forensic examination. They located the knife that Amy Pitson used, and a close inspection of her car found traces of what appeared to be an alarming amount of her son's blood. Yet upon analysis, only Amy's blood was to be found on the knife at the scene. To the relief of investigators, close relatives of the Pitsons revealed that in the run-up to Timothy's disappearance, he had suffered a rather large nosebleed in the car, and this was why so many trace particles could be found inside the vehicle. Amy Pitson's cell phone was nowhere to be found at the scene of her death, but it was later found in a grassy verge on the edge of Route 78, evidently tossed out of the window of her moving vehicle as she returned to Illinois. But analysis of her cell phone records shed no further light on what she had done, nor why she had done it, and there were no clues regarding her son's whereabouts to be found. Furthermore, the analysis of Amy's vehicle revealed that at some point she had been parked in a grassy area. There were traces of clay embedded in the vehicle's tires, which investigators surmised had come from a place with a stream or a river nearby. Thus, it was highly possible that Amy had driven into a rural area, possibly off the road, in order to hand Timothy over to his new keepers. Pitson has since made it abundantly clear that he believes that his son is still very much alive, and in August of 2018, the since-canceled law enforcement TV show, Live PD, showed their viewers some digitally generated age progression images showing what Timothy might look like at age 13. The guest on that episode of the show was Angeline Hartman of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who urged members of the public to come forward with any and all information that might help police locate Timothy. But none of the calls that were made as a result came to anything at all. However, less than a year later, calls were made to police in northern Kentucky that brought a phenomenal amount of hope to those who wished for Timothy's return, but also revealed an unfathomable mystery and an unimaginable evil. On the 3rd of April 2019, citizens in the city of Newport called local police to inform them that a teenage boy was wandering in nearby streets, apparently in a daze, after having run across a bridge on the Ohio River. Police soon located the young man, who was shaken, distraught, and exhausted, and who required a great deal of consoling before he could even bring himself to speak. Police asked the teenager for his name, and his reply shook them to their core. "Timothy," he stammered. "Timothy Pitson." The boy was rushed to Louisville, Kentucky's largest city, where he was interviewed by detectives regarding his apparent disappearance 8 years previously. He said he couldn't remember a thing, that the most he could recall was escaping a house in neighboring Ohio before running across the river bridge. But DNA tests would reveal something that was devastatingly disappointing to James Pitson, who was indescribably overjoyed at the sudden breakthrough in the case. The boy was not Timothy Pitson. The entire story was an intricate lie, fabricated by then 23-year-old Brian Michael Reaney. Reaney has been released from Belmont Correctional Institution in Ohio, just shy of a month prior to his terrible claims. He had served just 14 months on charges of burglary and vandalism, resulting from acts committed in Medina County. Sergeant Bill Rowley, spokesman for Aurora Police, later released a statement saying, "Although we are disappointed that this turned out to be a hoax, we remain diligent in our search for Timothy, as our missing persons case remains unsolved." One cannot possibly imagine what would have possessed Brian Michael Reaney to tell such a heinous and evil lie. It is possible that he had seen an episode of Live PD, or somehow heard of Timothy's disappearance whilst incarcerated, and wished to hit back at a world that he viewed with what must be a remarkable degree of contempt. But either way, Timothy Pitson remains missing to this day, and there have been no sightings of the boy since the day he suddenly disappeared at the hands of his mother. However, No bodies have been found, not even a drop of blood that wasn't easily explainable. So it is entirely possible that he is still out there, somewhere in the United States, just waiting to be found. I'm only 23, and I'm a very social person, so I've seen a lot of things, and I've encountered many strange people. But this experience may have been one of the most frightening and unsettling encounters of my life. This happened in the late summer dark of 2021. It was mid-September, so the school year had just started. I was a senior in college, and my group of friends and I decided we wanted to go camping. Not overnight camping. We just wanted to go out in the warm night and sit around a fire in the woods, make s'mores, chill, and maybe have some drinks. One of my friends, who was a girl, Landry, had come up with the idea to do this after classes were over that Friday. Landry brought some of her friends, Gracie and Lily. I asked my two roommates, Wyatt and Marshall, if they wanted to come. They both agreed. So there were 6 of us in total, 3 girls and 3 boys. We were all just college friends having a good old time. We had all been out there for maybe 30 minutes when I heard footsteps in the woods. As soon as I heard the footsteps, everyone else must have heard them too. All of the talking around the campfire turned to silence. I think the reason it startled everyone was because of 2 reasons. 1, because the footsteps were heavy, and it was unmistakably something much larger than a small game animal like a squirrel or a rabbit. And 2, because it was clearly not a deer or another 4-legged animal because of the frequency of the footsteps. The footsteps were hitting the leaves one at a time. If it was a deer, there would be simultaneous thuds on the ground indicating a creature with 4 legs. Given the way the leaves were crunching one step at a time, it couldn't be anything but something large that was traveling on 2 legs. Suddenly, there was a thud on the ground about 30 yards away from us, as if whatever was moving through the woods had fallen. The footsteps had now stopped. We knew whatever it was had to still be in the woods near us, just stagnant. Needless to say, we all had our guard up now. The strong, unsettling feeling of being watched soon got the best of us, so we all agreed to just take our things and quickly leave. As soon as we all started to get up, we heard a voice from the woods in that same direction yell in a creepy, friendly tone. It was a man's voice, and he said something along the lines of, "Hey, where are you guys going?" The girls immediately started running back to the truck without getting their stuff, which was maybe 100 yards away. I wasn't really scared, but I definitely knew something wasn't right. Wyatt was obviously flustered, but he was trying to hide it. He grabbed his stuff and started to walk back without saying a word. Meanwhile, Marshall called back to whoever was in the woods. He said something along the lines of, "What do you mean?" Or something stupid like that. We were the only 2 people still within earshot of the man in the woods now. Marshall was toying with danger, and we both knew it. The man replied with something along the lines of, "I'm stuck in the woods and I need help." Marshall was kind of being a jerk and said something like, "How could you be stuck in the woods? Did you get caught in a bear trap?" After there was no answer, Marshall said that he had got him. Marshall and I grabbed the girls' stuff and started toward the truck. I remember walking back thinking that Marshall is an idiot for doing that. As Marshall and I were approaching the truck, I looked at my phone and had some missed calls from Landry. I found out why as soon as we got back in the truck, when Wyatt and the girls simultaneously started trying to tell me and Marshall about how they saw multiple tall silhouettes walking near the tree line in the moonlight. They explained how the shadow outlines were walking in the direction of where we had set up camp. We obviously didn't think they were lying after the exchange Marshall just had with the guy in the woods. Immediately following, We promptly booked it out of that place. In retrospect, it could have been some guys just playing games out in the woods. But more realistically, it was probably some sort of gang or cult or something like that. I'm just glad we were so lucky to get out of there when we did. Or who knows what could have happened. When I was a young boy, I always had a lot of trouble falling asleep at night. I would lie awake, my mind racing with anxiety. It would get so bad that I would carry my pillow and blanket around the house and see if I could maybe sleep better in the living room, or sometimes even on my parents' bedroom floor. Looking back, this is pretty embarrassing, but there's a reason I mention it. Every so often, I would stay at my Nana's house with my younger brother. It was a 3-story duplex in one of those gated seniors communities that spring up in residential areas surrounding hospitals. When I was 8, my grandfather passed away from cancer at the hospital right around the corner. Since then, my Nana has always lived alone. Even still, I remember enjoying spending time there, eating lots of food, playing video games, watching lots of VHS-taped shows about alien encounters and ghostly hauntings. That's where I got my thrills. That being said, I've always considered myself skeptical to the paranormal. However, something happened one of those nights at my Nana's house that to this day, over a decade later, I still cannot explain. On this particular night, it was only me staying over at Nana's house. The upstairs floor of her 3-story duplex consisted of 2 bedrooms, a large master bedroom, and right across the hallway was another smaller bedroom. Most nights when I stayed over with my younger brother, we would both sleep in the smaller bedroom, but there was always something a little creepy about that bedroom. And on the night I decided I won't be sleeping alone in that room, instead I'll just take a pillow and blanket and sleep on the floor in my Nana's master bedroom. My family was used to my strange sleeping habits, so it was no problem. I made my bed on the floor, in between the door and the queen-sized bed that furnished the master bedroom, and swiftly fell asleep. I woke up tossing and turning in the middle of the night. It must have been in the very early AM hours. The room was very dark. To my right is the large bed where my Nana lay sleeping. To my left is the bedroom door, left ajar only slightly. I can hear my Nana sleeping in her bed, the soft inhale and exhale of someone in a deep sleep. And then a troubling realization takes hold of me. I notice that hers isn't the only pattern of breathing that I can hear. To my left, in the direction of the hallway and the room directly across the hall, I can hear a completely separate inhale and exhale. It sounded as though someone was standing right outside the bedroom door, breathing loudly. I can remember thinking to myself, am I just imagining this? Or am I hearing myself? I remember holding my breath and listening, and then guaranteed myself that I was hearing 2 different people breathing. It was easy to tell because the breathing sounds were on opposite sides of me. It continued for at least a full minute, and the more I paid attention to it, the more terrified I became. In the moment, I pulled my blanket over my head and convinced myself that maybe for some reason, one of my other relatives had shown up and needed to crash in her guest bedroom. Somehow, I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, sitting down at a stack of pancakes, I asked my Nana if anyone had been over last night. She told me no, and asked me why I asked, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I had experienced the night before. Being in a gated community, she would have had to buzz through any visitors that arrived. That's the one and only time I've ever experienced something that I just cannot explain. When I was in college, I worked the night shift one summer vacation. I was 19 years old and an average-looking female. I wasn't enthused about having to work a job over the summer, but it was the only way I was going to be able to afford tuition. Working night shift was probably the weirdest experience of my life. It was at the McDonald's drive-thru. I still remember my first night on the job. This lady came in and was talking to someone while she was waiting for us to take her order. She sounded extremely upset, and she was screaming at the top of her lungs. It sounded like it was directed at someone in the back seat. I immediately assumed that she was abusing her children. I'm a psychology major, so I naturally pick up on stuff like that. She ordered 3 Big Macs and 3 large Cokes. My intuition has been wrong. When she pulled up to pay for her meal, she was completely alone. I was honestly a little startled. Why would this lady be here ordering this much food and screaming in her car if she was alone? I couldn't wrap my head around the situation. She was otherwise polite. She was nice as she spoke to me and paid for her food and left. She even told me to have a good night. She had been the only customer we had in a probably 45-minute window. And after she left, I saw some of my coworkers laughing at me. I asked, "What's so funny?" And he told me that it was my first encounter with Schizo Susan. They told me that she regularly did stuff like this, and always showed up at all hours of the night to order seemingly too much food. She was always yelling at people in her car, but there was never anyone actually in her car. They didn't actually know her name, so they just started calling her Schizo Susan. They told me that there were occasional nights when she was the only customer to come through the drive-thru at all. I found it extremely unnerving. I immediately started wondering what was wrong with this woman. About a week went by. She came in every night, just like they said. And in between speaking to me to order her food and picking up her food, she was always yelling at someone. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was up. So I formulated a plan. I was just going to ask her who she was speaking to. You know, play it off like I thought she was talking to me. It was the best I could come up with without seeming abrasive. I remember it being a Friday night when I decided I was going to do it. I had chickened out a couple of times, but I figured that since I don't work the weekends, may as well try something new to end my last shift for the week. Well, the night that I did it, I listened in to her screaming for a few more seconds than I normally did. You see, I can listen to what people are saying through the McDonald's speaker without them necessarily knowing that I'm listening. If I don't say anything, they would never know. I normally never did this because it's kind of frowned upon. I'm pretty sure there's some kind of rule against it. But I listened for maybe 20 or 30 seconds. I listened for long enough to know that she was yelling at someone named Darian. When she was in the middle of saying something, I interrupted her and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, were you speaking to me?" She just replied, "No." Crap, I thought to myself. I knew that I had to try something else. I asked her if Darian would be ordering with her. Then she went silent. It wasn't an entire minute, but she didn't say anything. After the second time of asking her if she was still there, she let out a banshee scream. It was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. It really hurt my ears. The McDonald's microphone system is already pretty loud, but when someone screams into it, trust me when I say that it is the most unbearable thing you have ever experienced. I was also surprised at how long she screamed. She had one deep, loud, guttural scream going for like 30 entire seconds. In the moment, though, I was scared for my life. I also got really worried that I was going to lose my job. I felt really guilty for asking, like it was my fault for setting her off. In retrospect, I don't think I really did anything horrible to her. Literally just asked her if the person whose name she was screaming just a minute ago was also going to be ordering food. She didn't actually say anything when she screamed. It was just kind of a violent and guttural screaming. I was really taken aback there for a minute. How the heck do you even respond to that? I asked her if she wanted to continue placing her order, and that's when she just drove away. She really floored it and drove way faster than she should have. And as she drove by, I saw her face looking at me through the window. It must have been only a split second that I could see her, but I got that one really good look at her. She looked extremely distressed, and as if things couldn't get any weirder, the microphone system stopped working correctly the rest of the night. I think she screamed loud enough to break something in it. That was hands down the weirdest thing to ever happen to me throughout any jobs I've ever worked. And this weird lady just disappeared after that. She stopped coming to McDonald's altogether. I asked some of my other coworkers how long she had been stopping by for her nightly visits, and they all said that it was for as long as they can remember, which probably meant at least a year. I felt somewhat guilty for pissing this lady off so bad, but I think it is safe to say she probably needs some serious mental help. I haven't worked at McDonald's in a long time, and I don't ever plan on working fast food again. I just hope that wherever that lady ended up, she got the help that she so desperately and obviously needed. The other day, I remember this one little story that happened to one of my friend's old neighbors. His old neighbor lived in a really small RV park. Anyway, he liked to go back there to visit her a lot, since they were pretty close. I was his ride at the time, so I would usually end up hanging out there with them. The small RV park was located right off a main road and a highway that led directly into one of our small, historic townships. The park was shaded by mostly tall oak trees, so it was often nice and breezy in the hot summers. Since it was such a small neighborhood in the RV park, everyone had no choice but to know everyone. While we were hanging out there one day, my friend's former neighbor and her other neighbor started commenting on the fact that there were tons of ants. That was unusual to them, since they lived there for years and never had that problem before. Eventually, after dealing with the ants being absolutely everywhere for a couple days, my friend's old neighbor decided to go outside and try to track the ant trails to see where they may be coming from. She ended up tracking them to an RV that was one space away from hers. There, she found several trails of them both going into and coming from this man's RV. Everyone in the little neighborhood knew that the man who lived in that RV was somewhat of a hoarder, and he was not clean at all. So, she knocked on his door a few times, but he didn't seem to be there, so she decided to tape a note to his door for when he got home. In the note, she asked that he please have his son maybe pick up some ant traps, and also to have him maybe clean up a little. The man who lived there was quite weak and ill with MRSA. I believe MRSA is a disease that can be passed through bodily fluids and such, and I also believe it is eventually fatal. Thankfully, though, he had his son around to do his errands and some other things to help care for him. A couple days after she had left the note on his door, she got a knock on her door, and it was the man's son. What he had to say was the grossest and most horrifying thing I have heard. What had happened was that when the man's son came by to take his dad to an appointment, he knocked, but didn't get an answer. As he was waiting for his dad to answer the door, he realized he hadn't heard from him in almost a week. I guess his dad usually called him at least every other day or so. Since his dad wasn't answering him, his son went to go grab the spare key that his dad had given to him previously. When he let himself into his dad's RV, he made a morbid and terrifying discovery. He found his dad's decomposing body still in his bed, totally covered in ants. He ran out of there, and it didn't take long for a neighbor to find him sobbing next to his vehicle. Within minutes, the whole small community had heard the gruesome news. As it just so happened, I had taken my friend over there for us to all hang out again on the day his old neighbor had heard the terrible news. We didn't even get a chance to sit down before she was already telling us about it. As she was telling us about all the ants on his body, I just couldn't help but to think about how ants come into your house, crawl all over your sinks, counters and dishes, and even in your food. So, for whatever reason, the ants were truly the most horrific part to me. After all, MRSA can be passed through bodily fluids. We didn't go back there for a while after hearing that. When we did, though, they were still in the process of trying to move the RV out of there, and that was after a man in a full hazmat suit spent days cleaning it out. The whole thing just kind of freaked us all out, though. Especially the ants. During the mid-19th century, the United States saw a sharp rise in the number of people who chose to leave their homes in the East to resettle in the California or the newly acquired Oregon territories. For many, a new life in California meant freedom from financial servitude, or freedom to practice their own particular brand of Christianity without judgment from their peers back east. Others were attracted to the West's new and exciting economic opportunities, or inspired by the idea of manifest destiny. But for one group of migrants, their pursuit of the American dream would quickly turn into a nightmare. One characterized by isolated mountain passes, freezing cold and stomach-twisting hunger. In the spring of 1842, a wagon train that was almost 500 strong headed out from Independence, Missouri, seeking to follow an established trail that would lead them to the promised land of California. Taking their place at the rear of the wagon train was a group of 9 wagons containing 32 members of the Reed and Donner families. The family patriarch, George Donner, had spent time in a number of eastern states before finally making the decision to move his family west. At first, heavy traffic on the trails leading eastward, as well as the large number of other travelers, meant that the journey is relatively easy. Traveling in the summer months could be hot and tiresome, but it paled in comparison with how difficult navigation during the winter would be. It was essential that the wagon train make as much ground as possible, while it was still possible. For winter was coming, and it would not be merciful. By the end of September 1842, an attempt at a shortcut had gone terribly wrong for the Donner-Reed families. Seeking to overtake the Sierra Nevada mountains before the winter arrived, they had successfully traversed the Great Salt Lake Desert, but complications meant that they had in fact slowed themselves down by about a month. Lack of water in the harsh, dry desert had driven the party to near madness and caused casualties among its essential accompaniment of oxen and other cattle. Tensions among the party members were reaching breaking points. In the following month of October, many of wagons that made up the original party had gone their separate ways, either pushing on towards California or making their way back eastward. In the group that remained, 2 wagons became entangled, and a man by the name of John Snyder attempted to remedy the situation. He lacked patience and soon began mercilessly whipping one of the oxen. Soon, James Reed, the oldest and most senior member of the Reed family, attempted to intervene to stop the beating. But Snyder reacted furiously to the intervention and turned the whip in his hand towards Reed. A physical altercation ensued, one that was only ended when James Reed took out a long, steel Bowie knife and plunged it into Snyder's chest. Despite Reed's explanation of self-defense, the party members convened to decide his punishment. United States laws were not applicable west of the Continental Divide in what was then Mexican territory, and wagon trains often dispensed their own justice. Some suggested that Reed should hang for his crimes, but it was eventually decided that he should merely be banished from the wagon train, but on pain of death should he attempt to return. What was once a happy adventure into the West had become a vicious fight for survival. Grass was becoming scarce, and the animals were steadily weakening. To relieve the animals' load, everyone was expected to walk. The trials that the Donner Party had so far endured resulted in splintered groups, each looking out for themselves and distrustful of the others. In one incident of abject cruelty, an elderly man was ejected from the wagon he was reliant on for transport, being told that he had to walk or die. A few days later, the elderly man sat next to a stream, his feet so swollen they had split open. Some members of the party begged the others to wait for him, to show mercy to the party's weakest members, but the others refused, thinking only of themselves. The old man was not seen again. In the following weeks, attacks from the local Paiute Indian tribe were responsible for the party losing almost 40 of their cattle. This is extremely shocking for a number of reasons. Firstly, the Paiute tribe had first appeared friendly to the migrants, sharing supplies with them and even directing them onto trails that would take them westward. But at some point, the relationship had soured, and the people known for their respect and reverence of the natural world appeared to have no problem slaughtering the wagon train's animal accompaniment in an attempt to slow down or even stop the party dead in their tracks. With nearly all the cattle gone, one particular party member stopped to bury his wagon for safekeeping. 2 of his number stayed with him to help, but they returned without him, reporting they had been attacked by Paiutes, murdered and scalped. By the end of October, the party was forced to make camp around Truckee Lake in the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. 3 widely separated cabins of pine logs served as their homes, with dirt floors and poorly constructed flat roofs that leaked when it rained. Of the 60 at Truckee Lake, 19 were men over 18 years old, 12 were women, and 29 were children, 6 of whom were toddlers or younger. Very little food remained in their supplies, and the oxen began to die. Their carcasses were frozen and stacked. Truckee Lake was not yet iced over, but the pioneers were unfamiliar with catching lake trout. The most experienced hunter among them killed a bear, but had little luck after that. Margaret Reed promised to pay double when they got to California for the use of 3 oxen from other families. She was charged $25, normally the cost of 2 healthy oxen, for the carcass of a single ox that had starved to death. The mood in the camp was beyond tense. People were only looking out for themselves by this point, but an incoming blizzard would be the straw that broke the mules' back. During the height of the snowstorm, a man named Patrick Dolan began to rant deliriously, stripped off his clothes, and ran into the woods. He returned shortly afterwards and died a few hours later. Not long after, some of the group began to eat flesh from Dolan's body. The next morning, the group stripped the muscle and organs from Dolan's body, then dried them to store for the days ahead, taking care to ensure nobody would have to eat his or her relatives. As the days went by, more and more of the party succumbed to their desperate hunger and made the decision to consume human flesh. Some were determined to continue hunting and fishing, only turning to cannibalism when there was no other option. But it appeared some preferred the taste of human flesh and eschewed the long and tiring hunting trips in favor of consuming those who died of disease and malnutrition. At one point, a scouting party, looking for the most efficient way ahead, came across 2 Miwok Indians named Luis and Salvador. They had once been party members, but had attempted to move on when the supplies had run low. At the time they were discovered, they had not eaten anything for 9 whole days, and were dangerously undernourished and weakened as a result. However, instead of attempting to rescue and save the lives of their Indian friends, one of the scouting parties simply shot them there and then before carving off chunks of their flesh with a hunting knife. On January 12th, the group stumbled into a Miwok camp looking so deteriorated that the camp's inhabitants initially fled, fearing them to be the spirits of undead souls who wandered the snow-capped mountain range. Once it was clear that they were in fact the survivors of a disastrous expedition, the Miwoks gave them what they had to eat: acorns, grass, and pine nuts, completely unaware that the group had murdered and eaten 2 starving members of their tribe. They were shaken, starving, and had arguably sold their souls to stay alive. But they were safe now. Relatively safe, anyway. Reporting on the event across the U.S. was heavily influenced by the national enthusiasm for westward migration. In some papers, news of the tragedy was buried in small paragraphs, despite the contemporary tendency to sensationalize stories. Several newspapers, including those in California, wrote about the cannibalism in graphic, exaggerated detail. In some print accounts, the members of the Donner Party were depicted as heroes, and California a paradise worthy of significant sacrifices. But it seems that sacrificing one's family and friends, as well as losing one's humanity through consuming human flesh, might not be worth any prize, no matter how great. As a young child, I had a very active imagination. As an adult, I am very skeptical about ghosts and the paranormal, but as a 7-year-old child in the early 90s, I remember seeing and witnessing stuff which a rational mind would conclude to be impossible. Regardless, I remember such events. In some instances, I was with other individuals who too shared my experiences of these paranormal sightings, who also have profound memories of them to this day. In the 90s, my family owned a small village pub called the Crown Inn. The establishment is situated in the English countryside. Like many public houses in England, the Crown Inn was very old and at the center of many tragic stories, including murder. I would spend many hours exploring the Victorian building whilst my brother played with his friends in the village, and when my parents worked. I would often spend a lot of time by myself in the upstairs flat, and during these times, I recall witnessing objects flying across the room, furniture hovering feet off the ground, and other such occurrences. I would convince myself that these were just simply hallucinations, or my excitable imagination. However, the family dog would also react to these unexplained events. On one occasion, Jake, my black Labrador, bolted out of a bedroom with his tail between his legs when a table lifted off the ground. He ran to the bottom of the stairs and urinated all over the carpet. During this time, I was sure that we were not alone in the pub. I will detail one particular night that sits vividly in my mind, which I catch myself pondering about to this day. It was late at night. The pub was closed down and everybody in the building was in bed, asleep. At this time, I shared a bedroom with my brother and also shared a double bed. I remember waking up in the dark and silent room. Only a slight bit of light spilled through the window from the street, very faintly illuminating items around me. I first focused on my brother, who was sound asleep just a few feet to my left. Still laying on my back, I turned my head the other way, and as I was about to close my eyes, something caught my attention. On the wall to my right-hand side, adjacent to the bed, and slightly raised towards the ceiling, was something I couldn't at all comprehend. There were no pictures, paintings, or any items hanging from this particular wall, and apart from the window, the wall was completely bare. Except, of course, this strange thing. Being intrigued of this item fully aroused my attention, and I must have gazed at this object for what felt to be a few minutes. The item was almost egg-shaped, no larger than an American football. Then I felt my heart starting to beat faster, and a cold sensation ran down the length of my spine as I started to slowly understand what I was looking at. The light reflected off the object to make out what appeared to be a cheekbone. As soon as I recognized this, I could make out a masculine jawline, an ear, a nose, and a mouth. I was completely frozen when it was evident I was staring at somebody's face. No other part of the body was visible apart from the facial features peering, what seemed to be, through the wall. The face was slightly turned away from me, as if its attention was drawn to something at the foot of the bed. Through my fear, I did my best to remain completely motionless, still staring at this face, studying this insane image in front of me. I recall its eyes were casually looking away from me, as if in deep thought, almost sorrowful. The bed made a slight noise as I unintentionally shifted my weight on the mattress. Instantly, the face in a jolting reflex motion turned straight towards me, as if it had been rudely disturbed, its wide open eyes staring directly into mine. In every sense of the word, I was utterly petrified. It sounds peculiar to describe, but the face was contorted with such an intense expression, a concoction of extreme delight and anger at the same time. It was horrifying to behold, to say the least. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream as this horrifying thing gazed deep into my eyes, no more than a couple feet away from me. Desperately wishing for this crazy event to stop, we both faced each other in the dark for a few moments. It then did something which makes the hair stick up on the back of my neck, even to this day. The face almost composed itself for a second, until slowly revealing a psychopathic grin, a horrible distorted smile, before slowly descending down the wall. I helplessly watched as the face moved down towards the ground, never breaking eye contact, until it was completely out of my sight. I thought my heart was going to explode inside my chest as I laid there, witnessing the face disappear. "It's under the bed! It's under the bed!" The thought screaming in my mind. I tried to move my arms and legs, but I couldn't, almost as if I was paralyzed. I tried and tried again, desperately trying to get myself out of the room. In one last final attempt, my arms broke free, followed by my legs. I stood up in the bed and darted across the mattress, over my brother and out of the room, never once looking behind me. I ran directly into my parents' room, screaming all the way there, waking up the whole pub, including Jake, the family dog. My mom consoled me for a while, and for the rest of the night I stayed in my parents' bed. It took a few nights before I built up the courage to go back into that room again. With an adult's mind, it would be a fair conclusion that I likely suffered from sleep paralysis, which is something I do suffer with time to time as an adult. With those who are unfamiliar with this condition, it is where you become temporarily paralyzed just before falling asleep or waking up. On rare occasions, individuals also claim to have hallucinations during these episodes, expressing seeing ghosts or demons. I'm slightly skeptical of this because I hadn't knowingly suffered from sleep paralysis until I was in my teens, and although it's happened to me a handful of times, I have never hallucinated. Episodes in bed like this never happened to me again, and with everything else that I experienced in that building for the 10 years we lived there, I simply can't rule out that something else was awake with me in the room that night. Back when I was much younger, my friends and I were into urban exploring before it was even really a thing. We grew up in a pretty rough area with a lot of old apartment buildings that had to be abandoned and eventually demolished due to asbestos. That stuff made them basically fireproof, but where fire and smoke will kill you quick, asbestos will kill you slow. But try explaining that to a bunch of teenagers, actively looking for somewhere to hide from grown-ups, so they could do some distinctively grown-up things. Where other people saw a decrepit, dusty crap hole, we saw our own little corner of paradise. A home away from home. Or maybe home is too strong a word, but you get the idea. Anyway, there was one particular estate that was almost completely bereft of inhabitants, having been gradually relocated by the city council until there must have been no more than 2 or 3 families left over. It was like an actual ghost town. Even the local corner shop had its shutters permanently down, with a for sale sign quickly following its indefinite closure. But like I said, that kind of place was our bread and butter. So when they moved out, we moved in. There was this one set of high-rise flats, that means apartments to you North Americans, that we used to visit on the regular. The heating and other utilities had been switched off for a while, and this was in the middle of winter, so we used to stash cans of cider in the old cupboards, and they'd basically act like walk-in fridges. It got to the point that we ended up occupying one of the flats, bringing over an old nylon string guitar and other amenities so the place felt a bit more homey. So this one night, just after Christmas, about 5 of us pile into the old place to get drunk and have a sing-song. I remember that we were halfway through Bowie's Man Who Sold the World when the off-key twang of his string breaking had us all groaning with disappointment. What's more, it was the G string. Anyone who knows anything about playing a guitar will tell you, break a top or bottom string, and it's not the end of the world. But break your G string, and nothing quite sounds the same. So there we were, basically condemned to a silent disco for the night. But it didn't dampen our spirits entirely, so we committed to staying for a few hours to at least make the most of the evening. We are all just sitting around, chatting bollocks and bumming smokes off each other, when one of us loudly hushes the rest of us, before holding a single finger in the air, as if to say, "Listen." There's a brief silence, and I do mean silence. No one heard a thing. So the lad who had shushed everyone just put it down to him hearing things. The mood softens again quickly, and we're back to drinking and hanging out. Only a little while later, the same lad does the same hushing thing. He's not alone this time, though. Another one of us swore that he too had heard something. A scratching or shuffling noise coming from the dark corridor outside the flat. If you have one lad with an attack of paranoia, it's easy to forget. If you have 2 lads hear the same bloody thing, you start to take things a bit more serious. One of us pokes their head out of the flat, shining the light off of his phone's screen into the darkness, before turning back to tell us there was nothing there. These flats were half falling down. It was perfectly reasonable to expect them to creak and croak a fair bit, but the 2 guys who had heard the noises remained anxious, shooting each other nervous looks in between scanning the flat's open doorway for movement. Cut to a few hours later, and it's coming up to midnight. Energy levels are dipping severely, and so are the noise levels. This meant the atmospherics were perfectly attuned for us to perfectly hear the creaking of a floorboard just above our heads. This wasn't just the rundown condition of the building either. It was painfully obvious that the slow and deliberate creak came from a footfall on the floor above us. Don't ask me how we knew that. Sometimes your gut just tells you everything you need to know about a certain sound or a shape in the darkness. That's how the human race has survived for so long and so successfully. There really is such a thing as a sixth sense. As soon as we hear that creak, we all freeze. I mean proper statue still, barely even breathing, with all eyes glued to the ceiling. We start asking each other what that was, but we all knew. Someone or something was up there, and it had been the entire time. I should add at this point, we had managed to compile a little collective of wooden sticks, iron bars, and other such debris that we told ourselves were our weapons stash. It was all just a bit of a joke, to be honest. They were purely totemic value. But in the moments that followed that horrible, bloody creek, I thanked that what was holy that we had had the foresight to collect them. Each of us grabbed something to defend ourselves with before falling silent again, listening out for any other creaking sounds above us. We weren't left waiting long. Another creak, then another, each one getting closer and closer to where the front entrance to the upstairs flat would be. We couldn't help but sit there, terrified, listening as whatever was up there got closer and closer to us. When the footsteps stopped, one of us plucked up the courage to creep towards the open front door to the flat and stick their head out. The next thing I know, we're just pouring down the stairs of the apartment block, with the lad who scouted the stairs out shouting how there's someone up there. We were scared, maybe a little over-paranoid, but over the next few days, we started to question if we'd even seen what we thought we had. I remember seeing the shape of something on the stairs above us, but I wasn't 100% sure it was a man, and neither was anyone else, if we were honest with ourselves. In the end, I had convinced myself that we had imagined the whole thing, and decided to run a little experiment. I left a loaf of bread in the lobby of the apartment block, intending to prove that there was no one living there when the loaf was still there, growing mold a few days later. But when I went back, it was gone. Years later, we watched the council demolish those flats as wrecking balls smashed into the brickwork and plastic window frames. We mourned our old hideaway, yes, but mostly, we wondered if whoever was in there would be buried in the rubble. This time of year, nothing pairs better with too much food and alcohol than grim, macabre tales of murder and mayhem. This particularly ghastly tale takes place on Christmas Day, 1929, on a farm outside Germantown, North Carolina. Charlie Lawson's big Christmas surprise for his adoring family of 9 began with a trip into town. Sparing no expense, Charlie Lawson agreed to buy each and every member of his family an outfit for their choice before taking them over to a local photographer and having a family portrait taken. Quite a costly affair for a modest tobacco farmer. Just over a week later, it would be Christmas Day, 1929. One might get the impression that Charlie was a good father who tried to bring his family the best Christmas possible, even on his meager income. But you would be wrong. On the day itself, 17-year-old Marie Lawson had been busy in the kitchen preparing a fruitcake for after dinner that evening, while the younger sisters, 12-year-old Carrie and the 7-year-old Mabel, wandered over to their aunt and uncle's house to celebrate the holidays and relieve some of the pressure on Charlie and his wife. Fanny Lawson, Charlie's spouse of 17 years, had been tending to her and Charlie's younger children, while Charlie and his oldest son, 16-year-old Arthur, nicknamed Buck, had planned a very special Christmas Day hunting trip, something of a year tradition for the pair. As Charlie and Arthur prepared to set out on their holiday hunting trip, they soon realized that they needed more shotgun shells if they were to have a successful hunt. Charlie sent Arthur up to the store to pick up some more ammo, while he waited patiently in the tobacco barn. But when Charlie saw Carrie and Mabel walking down the path on their way back from their aunt and uncle's home, he shouldered his shotgun, aimed in the direction of his young children, and pulled the trigger. There is simply no telling of the absolute terror and confusion experienced by those poor girls. Charlie then set off towards the family home, his trusty weapon firmly in his grip. Fanny, who had been out on the front porch to investigate the gunfire, attempted to flee, but it was no good. There was no outrunning the blast. Hearing the gunshots from outside, the teenage Marie screamed bloody murder, trapped in a state of abject panic as her father racked the weapon and gunned her down in the kitchen. The youngest children heard the commotion and, fearing for their own lives, attempted to hide. Charlie quickly found them and brutally bludgeoned them to death with the butt of his weapon. Then, for some unknown reason, he then placed rocks under the heads of his dead wife and children and wandered off into the woods, as if in a daze. Concerned neighbors of the Lawsons initially walked over to wish them a Merry Christmas, heard the gunshots and hurried to check on them. Instead of the festive merriment they had come to expect, they stumbled onto a grisly tableau of blood, buckshot and shattered bone. Before they could set out to find Charlie, they had heard a single gunshot out in the woods. Charlie had taken his own life. By the time Arthur made it back from his trip into town, his entire family had been murdered. Folks at the town's general store had gotten word that something awful had happened, and someone in the town offered to give Arthur a ride back to the family farm. When he reached his home, the police had already arrived and a crowd began to gather. In the woods, police found footprints indicating that Charlie had been pacing around a tree for some time before taking his life. Next to his body were letters to both his parents. Some accounts reported that Charlie had placed stones over the eyes of his dead family members, as well as cushioning their heads with them. To this very day, no one is certain what exactly drove Charlie Lawson to slaughter his entire family, with the exception of young Arthur, before taking his life. Some speculate that Lawson had been abusing Marie and that she may well have been pregnant with an inbred child at the time of her death. Others have insisted that Charlie could not have had the capacity to commit the heinous acts that occurred on the family farm that Christmas Day, and that the entire thing had been staged to frame Charlie. A more credible explanation is that Charlie had developed a medical condition that affected his actions and caused him to experience a psychotic break. Perhaps he had knocked a screw loose after suffering a head injury while digging a ditch on the farm. Or, as some reported, he had some kind of painful growth on his chest that had him in constant agony, and he had decided to end it all and take his family with him. The killing attracted so much attention that an estimated 5,000 curiosity seekers attended the Lawson family funeral. They were all buried in a single large plot in the private Browder family cemetery, just outside of Germantown. The house became a macabre tourist attraction after the incident, and Charlie's brother decided to open the house to the public, charging admission for tours of the property. Still on the counter sat the cake that Marie had been making. Even after the house had been closed, the cake made its rounds in traveling dime museums. Protective plastic had to be used to cover the cake after several onlookers swiped some raisins. The cake toured for at least a decade before surviving family members buried the cake, along with the awful memories that came with it. Though the home was later demolished, the area still has enough spooky history to have inspired ghost sightings of the doomed Lawson children and the murderous Charlie Lawson. Unbelievably, the tragedy of the Lawson family didn't end in 1929. In 1945, James Arthur Lawson, the only child to survive the Christmas Day bloodshed, died at the age of 31 in a truck accident in Walnut Cove, North Carolina, quite near Germantown. He was buried in the same cemetery as the rest of his family, leaving behind 4 children of his own. When news of Arthur's death reached the local community, rumors of a family curse abounded. They insisted that Charlie had reached out to claim his son from beyond the grave. The murders also inspired the famed bluegrass duo, the Stanley Brothers, to pen a suitably morbid tune, recounting the Lawson family fate. The song includes the following lyrics. They say he killed his wife at first, while the little ones did cry. Please, Papa, won't you spare our lives? It is so hard to die. Most people don't even believe me when I tell them, but I have a job where I work from home. People in my area mostly work with cars or in the medical industry. There aren't many jobs where I live. Thankfully, I was able to land a decent paying job that let me work from my home office. It definitely comes with its struggles, but it is hands down the best job opportunity available to me right now. It isn't always perfect. It definitely comes with its pitfalls. Sometimes you have to sit at your computer even when there isn't any work to be done. It's also very easy to get distracted. But I think my biggest problem has to do with the house itself. It's kind of creepy. The house itself is an old Victorian, like really old. We're talking mid-1800s. A family friend owned the house and sold it to me for a very fair price. Basically gave it to me. I was super excited because it meant I got a nice big house to live in by myself along with my girlfriend. I'm a natural loner and don't really care for social interaction. So I had a nice big house all to myself and girlfriend and a job where I worked from home with very minimal social interaction with other people. That was basically my ideal life. But the house's age meant that it was going to be scary at times. And I don't mean with ghosts or anything like that, but sometimes I hear the house settling or making noises that I can't explain. I've actually had quite a few instances where I'll be sitting down and doing some work, and then out of nowhere, I hear a noise that I just can't rationalize. I go exploring throughout the house, only to find that nothing has changed. It's as ominous as it is frustrating. I did what just about anyone else in the world would do. I started to use background noise to drown out the disturbances. First, I tried those quiet instrumentals on YouTube. You know, the ones that last 5 hours and they're supposed to put you at ease or something. It didn't really work for me because I couldn't get my computer to be loud enough to drown out all the noises. It was also not very good at keeping my attention. There was one week where my work was really slow and there wasn't a whole lot to do. I still had to sit at my computer though. There was an understanding that I was allowed to basically do anything I wanted as long as I was available to my coworkers if something came through that needed to be done. I didn't quite know what to do with this time and just started watching documentaries on YouTube. It actually was pretty fun. I learned a lot. So that next week when things started picking up again, I just instinctively turned on a documentary. I wouldn't be able to have all my focus on it, but it was a lot better than having some ambient noise. It actually helped distract me from the sounds of the house. I guess I just didn't have enough mental focus energy to notice any of the other sounds going on around me, if that makes any sense. Well, it had been about 2 weeks of me watching documentaries while I worked. Everything seemed to be good, until one Friday morning. I start work at 8, and this must have happened around 10. I was sitting at my office chair working, while I listened to a documentary about a 9/11 conspiracy theory, when all of a sudden, I heard an abrupt banging noise coming from upstairs. Like I had said, I hadn't been distracted by any noises for a while by this point. So, the fact that I noticed this noise meant that it was probably serious. My fight or flight kicked in. You might laugh at me, but when I work, I keep a knife next to me. I ran upstairs with the knife and looked around for any suspicious noises. The banging had stopped, and I didn't know where it had come from. I knew what section of the house that I heard it from, but there didn't seem to be anything out of place. I stood there for a few moments, and then I heard it again. It happened right on the other side of my door. I immediately braced myself for there to be some kind of animal or something trying to get in. I didn't really know what to expect. I opened my door to see that the screen door had not been properly closed. My girlfriend didn't close it all the way when she left for work that morning. It was also pretty windy that day, so it was just going back and forth, causing a banging noise when the wind got bad. This was kind of a breaking point for me. I didn't want to live my life in constant paranoia and fear of some kind of attacker coming into my home. We live in a safe area. There's never been a serious threat, and I have run around my house with a knife way too many times now. I honestly felt kind of stupid, so I made a decision. I was no longer going to assume that someone was breaking in if and when I ever heard a sound. I put the knife in my dresser in my bedroom and decided that I was just going to be into work while I was working, except for my documentary, of course. So, there I was the next week. It happened on a Wednesday. I was sitting in my office doing exactly what I had set out to do. I was working, ignoring the noises, and listening to a documentary. I remember the exact part of the documentary I was on when I heard it. The sound was the loudest sound I had heard in the house up to that point. At first, I reassured myself that it was nothing and that I need to fight against this paranoia. The sound continued, and I couldn't take my mind off it. After about 5 minutes of listening to what sounded like rummaging and walking, I went upstairs to check. Bear in mind, I didn't have any weapon on me, and I was expecting some kind of reasonable explanation. When I got to my kitchen, I saw that the front door was wide open. The cabinets were all open, and there was a strange man rummaging through them. I didn't notice until after the fact, but he had been eating something. I remember screaming at him. I don't remember what I said, but it was something to the effect of, "What are you doing in my house?" Then he just ran off. Didn't say a word. He took a loaf of bread with him, but I don't think he took anything else, other than what he had eaten before I came upstairs. I reasoned with myself that he must have been a homeless man or something. I don't know why else you would steal a loaf of bread from a very ordinary-looking house. This was the worst thing that could have happened. On some instinctive level, it had proved all my worst fears right. There was some kind of danger in my house. And of course, it was the one time when I didn't have my knife on me. I lucked out that he didn't try to hurt me or anything, but it was still horrifying to see nonetheless. I just work at a local coffee shop now. It's the only way to stay sane.